The human brain is not designed to be honest. That sentence is uncomfortable, but it is biologically accurate. During the day, your brain does not ask what is true. It asks what is safe, what is acceptable, what will keep you inside the group. Honesty is optional. Survival is not. And survival for a social species means fitting in. If that idea feels unsettling, stay with it for a moment, because the moment night arrives, something precise and measurable begins to change. Not emotionally, not philosophically, but neurologically. Before we go any further, if you want more long-form science recordings like this, quiet, slow, and built from real neuroscience, take a second to like this video. Share it with someone who listens at night, and subscribe to Sleepy Scientist Recordings. These are not lectures. They are nighttime observations, and they only exist if people choose to keep them. Now, let's return to the brain. When we talk about the brain becoming honest at night, we are not talking about courage. We are not talking about vulnerability. We are not talking about personality. We are talking about systems switching offline. Throughout the day, your brain runs in what neuroscientists often describe as a task-positive, socially optimized mode. Large regions of the prefrontal cortex, especially the dorsolateral and ventromedial prefrontal areas, remain highly active. These regions are responsible for impulse control, self-monitoring, social prediction, and behavioral inhibition. In simple terms, they are the editors. They decide which thoughts are allowed to surface and which ones are stopped before you ever notice them. Most people assume that thoughts appear first, and then we choose whether to express them. Neuroscience suggests something more unsettling. Many thoughts never reach awareness at all. They are filtered out silently, automatically, before language forms. This filtering is not a flaw. It is an adaptation. Humans evolved in groups where saying the wrong thing, showing the wrong emotion, or wanting the wrong thing could cost safety, status, or survival. Over tens of thousands of years, the brain learned to preemptively suppress internal signals that might lead to social risk. That suppression requires energy. Cognitive control is metabolically expensive. The prefrontal cortex consumes a disproportionate amount of glucose and oxygen during waking hours, especially when social interaction is involved. Every polite smile, every withheld comment, every adjusted response costs something at the neural level. You do not feel this cost directly. You feel it as mental fatigue. As the day progresses, the brain's ability to maintain strict control slowly weakens. This is not a metaphor. It is observable in EEG patterns, reaction time studies, and functional imaging. Inhibition becomes less precise. Emotional signals bleed through more easily. Internal dialogue becomes louder. But during daylight, another force keeps the system stable: light. Light is not just visual input, it is a biological command. Photoreceptors in the retina send direct signals to a small structure deep in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This region acts as the master clock of the brain. It synchronizes hormonal release, body temperature, alertness, and cognitive priorities with the external day-night cycle. As long as light is present, this clock reinforces a state of readiness. Cortisol remains available. Dopamine systems stay responsive. The brain maintains a posture of engagement, and most importantly, the brain maintains the assumption that observation is possible, even when you are alone. From an evolutionary perspective, daylight means exposure. It means visibility. It means potential evaluation. So the social brain stays online, but when light fades, the signal changes. Melatonin secretion begins to rise. This hormone is often described as a sleep hormone, but that is an oversimplification. Melatonin does not force sleep. It changes priorities. It tells the brain that the external environment is becoming less relevant. Threat detection decreases, social prediction weakens, future-oriented planning slows. Functional imaging studies consistently show reduced activity in regions responsible for executive control and social monitoring as melatonin levels rise. At the same time, activity in the so-called default mode network increases. This network includes medial prefrontal areas, the posterior cingulate cortex, and structures closely linked to autobiographical memory and emotional processing. In other words, as night arrives, the brain turns inward. This transition is not dramatic. It is gradual, almost unnoticeable, but its consequences are profound. Thoughts that were previously filtered now have a higher probability of reaching awareness. Emotional memories that were tagged as non-urgent during the day are revisited. Internal conflicts that were postponed now re-enter processing. This is why people often describe nighttime thoughts as more real, not because they are more accurate, but because they are less edited. At night, the brain does not suddenly decide to be honest. It simply loses some of its ability to lie to itself. This distinction matters because honesty, in this context, is not moral. It is mechanical. As prefrontal inhibition weakens, limbic structures, particularly the amygdala and hippocampus, gain relative influence. These regions are deeply involved in emotional salience and memory integration. They do not care whether a thought is socially appropriate. They care whether it is unresolved. During the day, unresolved emotional material is often deferred. The brain prioritizes action, coordination, and external problem solving. Emotional processing is postponed not because it is unimportant, but because it interferes with performance. Night removes that pressure, cognitive load drops, external demands fade, and the brain begins a different kind of work. It reviews, it replays, it tests alternative outcomes. Neuroscientists refer to this as counterfactual processing, the generation of what-if scenarios. This process is essential for learning. By simulating alternative pasts, the brain refines future behavior. The problem is that counterfactual thinking feels like regret. It feels personal, it feels emotional, it feels honest. But it is not a judgment. It is a calculation. At night, without strong executive oversight, this calculation runs more freely. Thoughts appear in longer chains, emotions attach more strongly. The brain does not interrupt itself as often to check whether the content is useful, kind, or productive. This is why a thought at 2 a.m. can feel undeniable. Not because it is truer than a thought at noon, but because fewer systems are available to challenge it. By the time you notice this happening, the transition is already well underway. Your brain has shifted modes. The social editor is tired. The internal narrator is louder. And somewhere between reduced inhibition and increased emotional access, the experience of honesty emerges. This is also why morning often brings a strange reversal. With light comes cortisol. With cortisol comes structure. With structure comes suppression. Thoughts that felt urgent hours ago may now seem exaggerated or distant. The brain is not contradicting itself. It is changing configuration. There is no single true brain state. There are modes. Daytime is a mode optimized for coordination and survival in a visible world. Nighttime is a mode optimized for integration and internal repair. Honesty appears in the overlap, when control fades faster than awareness. Understanding this changes how we interpret nighttime thoughts. They are not confessions. They are not verdicts. They are signals emerging from a system temporarily freed from social constraint. Signals do not demand obedience. They demand observation. And that raises a deeper question, one that neuroscience does not answer directly, but prepares us to ask. If the brain can operate with such different priorities depending on light, chemistry, and fatigue, which version is closer to who you are? Or is that the wrong question entirely? Because perhaps the more accurate question is not which version is real, but why the brain needs so many versions in the first place. And to answer that, we have to look more closely at the part of the brain that decides what you are allowed to think and what it costs to keep it in charge. The part of the brain that decides what you are allowed to think is not mysterious. It is physical, it is measurable, and it is working far harder than you realize. At the center of this control system sits the prefrontal cortex, a broad region at the very front of the brain, just behind the forehead. From an evolutionary perspective, it is one of the newest additions to the human nervous system. From a functional perspective, it is the reason civilization works at all. This region does not generate emotions. It does not create desire. It does not store memory in the way people often imagine. Its primary function is regulation. It decides when to stop, when to wait, when not to act, and crucially, when not to think something all the way through. Neuroscientists sometimes describe the prefrontal cortex as an executive controller, but that metaphor hides something important. This area is not a neutral manager. It is biased. Its priorities are shaped by survival in a social environment. Functional MRI studies consistently show that the prefrontal cortex increases activity when people anticipate evaluation by others. Even subtle cues, a face, a name, the possibility of being judged, are enough to raise activation. The brain behaves differently when it believes it is being observed, whether or not anyone actually is. This is not paranoia. It is adaptation. For most of human history, visibility meant vulnerability. To be seen was to be assessed. To be assessed was to be accepted or rejected. The prefrontal cortex evolved to reduce the probability of rejection by suppressing thoughts, impulses, and expressions that could threaten social standing. This suppression happens before awareness. When researchers ask participants to respond honestly versus strategically in social tasks, they find that honest responses are often faster when prefrontal control is reduced. Strategic responses, on the other hand, require increased activation in prefrontal regions, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In other words, deception, including self-deception, is effortful, not morally, metabolically. The prefrontal cortex consumes energy continuously throughout the day. It maintains working memory, inhibits inappropriate impulses, predicts social consequences, and adjusts behavior in real time. This constant regulation creates what neuroscientists refer to as cognitive load. Cognitive load is not a feeling, it is a state. You experience it indirectly as mental tiredness, irritability, reduced patience, or difficulty concentrating. But beneath those subjective sensations is a measurable decline in regulatory precision. As load increases, control weakens. This is why people are more impulsive late in the day, why self-control failures cluster in the evening, why decision quality declines after prolonged social interaction. These patterns are not failures of character. They are limits of neural endurance. Importantly, the prefrontal cortex does not shut down all at once. Its functions degrade selectively. The most energy-intensive processes, long-term planning, abstract inhibition, and complex social prediction, are among the first to weaken. What remains active are more automatic systems, emotional evaluation, memory recall, associative thinking. This imbalance sets the stage for nighttime honesty. During the day, when prefrontal control is strong, many internal signals are labeled as irrelevant or dangerous. The brain does not argue with them. It simply prevents them from rising to awareness. At night, that gatekeeping becomes less reliable. Electroencephalography studies show increased frontal theta activity as people become mentally fatigued. This pattern is associated with reduced executive oversight and increased mind wandering. At the same time, connectivity between prefrontal regions and limbic structures becomes less tightly regulated. The result is not chaos, it is access. Thoughts that were previously interrupted now unfold further. Emotional memories that were partially activated are allowed to complete their activation cycle. Associations extend instead of being cut short. This is why nighttime thoughts often feel continuous. During the day, thinking happens in fragments. At night, it stretches. But this stretching has consequences. Without strong prefrontal interruption, the brain does not quickly distinguish between useful and non-useful signals. Emotional relevance becomes the primary sorting mechanism. If something carries emotional weight, it is allowed to persist. This is why nighttime thinking is rarely neutral. It gravitates toward unresolved experiences, unfinished conversations, imagined alternatives, and perceived failures. These are not chosen topics. They are selected automatically based on emotional tagging stored in memory circuits. The prefrontal cortex, when fully active, can override this selection. It can say, in effect, "This is not the right time. This is not productive. This can wait." At night, that voice grows quieter, not silent, just slower. The brain does not lose its capacity for logic, but logic is no longer the dominant filter. Emotional coherence temporarily outweighs social coherence. And this shift is not random. From a biological standpoint, night is the only safe window for this kind of internal processing. External demands are low, physical movement is reduced, social risk is minimal. The brain takes advantage of this window to address material that could interfere with future performance if left unattended. Honesty, then, is not the goal. Integration is. The experience of honesty emerges because integration requires access to raw material, not edited summaries. The brain needs to revisit events as they were felt, not as they were presented. This is also why nighttime thoughts often resist resolution. The prefrontal cortex excels at solutions, but integration is not solution-oriented. It is exposure-oriented. The brain reactivates emotional traces to weaken their intensity through repeated, low-threat exposure. This process is similar to mechanisms observed during REM sleep, but it begins earlier, during the quiet wakefulness that precedes sleep. As control loosens, The boundary between waking thought and pre-sleep processing becomes thinner, and somewhere in that thinning boundary, the sense of "this is what I really think" takes shape. But that sense can be misleading, because what you are experiencing is not the removal of all filters, only the weakening of one particular kind: social inhibition. Other biases remain fully active: memory distortion, emotional amplification, negativity bias. The brain at night is not more objective, it is more exposed, and exposure without context can feel like truth. This raises an important complication. If the prefrontal cortex is the primary editor during the day, and its influence diminishes at night, then honesty is not a stable trait. It is a state-dependent phenomenon, which means the question is no longer whether nighttime thoughts are true. The question becomes, true to which system? To the system optimized for survival among others, or to the system optimized for internal coherence? Because those two systems are not always aligned, and understanding that misalignment requires looking beyond control and fatigue and toward the deeper architecture of the brain's emotional core, the structures that continue working even when the editor steps back. And those structures do not speak in words, they speak in feelings, memories, and signals that resist simplification. To understand why those signals grow louder at night, we need to follow the shift in power from the cortex to the limbic system and see what happens when emotion is no longer managed, but allowed to lead. When control weakens, something else does not simply appear. It has been there all along. Beneath the layers of regulation, prediction, and social calibration lies a network that never truly sleeps. It does not care about reputation. It does not care about coherence. It does not care about how a thought sounds once spoken aloud. Its only concern is significance. This network is known collectively as the limbic system, and when night arrives, the balance of power inside the brain begins to tilt in its direction. To understand why the brain becomes emotionally honest at night, we have to understand what the limbic system actually does and what it does not do. The limbic system is not a single structure. It is a constellation of interconnected regions, including the amygdala, hippocampus, parts of the thalamus, and portions of the medial prefrontal cortex that behave very differently from their lateral counterparts. Together, these regions evaluate emotional relevance, encode memory with effective weight, and assign priority to experiences that matter for future survival. This system evolved long before complex language, long before abstract reasoning, and long before social strategy became central to human life. Its logic is older, simpler, and far more persistent. The limbic system does not ask whether a thought is appropriate. It asks whether it is unfinished. During the day, limbic signals are constantly generated. Emotional responses to small events, subtle disappointments, minor threats, unresolved desires, all of these produce neural activity. But most of this activity never becomes conscious. It is intercepted. The prefrontal cortex receives limbic input and evaluates it against context. Is this emotion useful right now? Is this memory relevant to the current task? Will acting on this signal improve outcomes? If the answer is no, the signal is dampened, not erased, delayed. This delay is not passive. It is active suppression, mediated by inhibitory circuits that require energy and attention to maintain. As long as those circuits are strong, limbic signals remain muted. At night, that strength diminishes. but the limbic system does not need permission to operate. It only needs reduced resistance. Functional imaging studies show that as prefrontal activity decreases in the evening, limbic regions do not necessarily increase their absolute activity. Instead, their relative influence grows. The editor steps back, and the raw feed becomes audible. This is a critical distinction. The brain at night is not flooded with new emotions. It is exposed to existing ones. This exposure changes the subjective texture of thought. Emotional signals are not discrete. They do not arrive as single points. They arrive as gradients, intensities that spread across memory, sensation, and expectation. When these gradients are no longer sharply cut off, they feel immersive. This is why nighttime thoughts often feel enveloping. A single memory can pull in others. A small regret can expand into a narrative. An unresolved feeling can seem suddenly enormous. The limbic system operates by association. When one emotionally tagged memory becomes active, it increases the probability that related memories will activate as well. This spreading activation is normally constrained by executive control. At night, the constraint weakens. The hippocampus plays a central role here. This structure is responsible for contextual memory, not just what happened, but where, when, and how it felt. During quiet wakefulness and early stages of sleep, the hippocampus replays patterns of activity associated with recent experiences. This replay is not a simple recording. It is selective. Events with emotional salience are prioritized. Events that were ambiguous, unresolved, or conflicting receive more attention. The brain is not reminiscing. It is attempting to integrate. Integration requires revisiting emotional context without immediate action. During the day, action is often required. Decisions must be made. Responses must be given. The brain cannot afford to linger. At night, lingering becomes possible. This is why nighttime honesty often comes with emotional intensity. The limbic system does not dilute affect. It amplifies it until integration occurs, or until sleep intervenes. The amygdala, often mischaracterized as a fear center, is better understood as a relevance detector. It flags stimuli that have emotional importance, whether positive or negative. At night, amygdala responsiveness to internally generated stimuli increases relative to externally driven demands. This does not mean the amygdala becomes hyperactive. It means its signals are less likely to be overridden. Studies have shown that sleep deprivation and circadian misalignment reduce functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. This decoupling leads to stronger emotional reactions and reduced regulatory feedback. In practical terms, emotions speak more freely. This is not dysfunction, it is a shift in hierarchy. The brain is temporarily prioritizing emotional bookkeeping over social performance. And emotional bookkeeping is not polite. It does not organize itself into balanced arguments. It does not wait for the right moment. It surfaces material based on urgency, not convenience. This is why nighttime honesty often feels intrusive. People do not choose to think about certain things at night. Those things arrive. They assert themselves. They demand attention not because they are true in an objective sense, but because they have not yet been integrated into the broader emotional model of the self. The brain does not seek peace by ignoring data. It seeks peace by resolving it. And resolution for emotional data often begins with full exposure. However, Exposure without structure can be overwhelming. Without the prefrontal cortex actively shaping narrative and perspective, emotional material lacks containment. Thoughts become repetitive, circular, and resistant to closure. This is why nighttime honesty often does not lead to insight. It leads to immersion. Immersion can feel like clarity, but it is not the same thing. Clarity requires distance. Night removes distance. The limbic system does not evaluate proportion. It evaluates presence. If a feeling is present, it is significant. If it is significant, it is foregrounded. This mechanism made sense in early evolutionary contexts. At night, physical activity decreased, and the risk of immediate threat was lower. The brain could safely process emotional memory without needing to prepare for rapid action. In modern environments, the physical context has changed, but the neural architecture has not. The brain still assumes that night is the appropriate time for internal recalibration. This assumption explains why ignoring nighttime thoughts often backfires. When emotional signals are suppressed repeatedly without integration, their salience increases. The limbic system escalates. Memories resurface with greater intensity. Associations widen. The brain is not punishing you. It is compensating for lack of acknowledgement. Acknowledgement does not mean agreement. It means allowing the signal to complete its activation cycle. This cycle often involves repetition, variation, and gradual reduction in intensity. Sleep plays a critical role here. As the brain transitions from wakefulness into non-REM sleep, slow-wave activity increases. This activity supports synaptic downscaling, the gradual weakening of overactive connections. Emotional signals that have been sufficiently activated and acknowledged are more likely to be down-regulated during sleep. Unacknowledged signals persist. This creates a feedback loop. Night brings emotional honesty. Honesty brings activation. Activation, if allowed, leads to integration. Integration enables rest. If the process is interrupted by distraction, resistance, or anxiety, the loop remains open. The brain keeps the file active. This is why people often experience the same thoughts night after night. It is not obsession. It is incomplete processing. Understanding this reframes nighttime honesty. It is not the brain revealing hidden truths about who you are. It is the brain attempting to finish emotional tasks postponed by daylight priorities. The feeling of honesty arises because the material is unfiltered, emotionally tagged, and internally sourced. But that does not make it definitive. It makes it raw. Raw data is essential, but it is not sufficient. Without the interpretive frameworks of the prefrontal cortex, raw emotional data lacks balance. It skews toward intensity and immediacy. It feels urgent because urgency is how the limbic system signals importance. The mistake many people make is assuming that urgency equals accuracy. It does not. Urgency means unresolved. This distinction becomes crucial when considering how to respond to nighttime thoughts. Engaging them as final judgments often increases distress. Suppressing them entirely prolongs activation. The brain is not asking for solutions at night. It is asking for space. Space to replay. Space to associate. Space to reduce emotional charge through exposure. This is why gentle acknowledgement is often more effective than analysis during late hours. Analysis recruits prefrontal systems that are already fatigued. Acknowledgement allows limbic activation to run its course. As night deepens, another transition begins. The brain does not stay in this emotionally open state indefinitely. As sleep pressure increases, even limbic activity begins to slow. But before that happens, there is a window, a narrow one, where honesty, emotion, and memory intersect most vividly. This window is not random, it is shaped by neural rhythms, and to understand why nighttime honesty follows a certain tempo, why thoughts arrive in waves rather than all at once, we have to look at the rhythms that govern communication inside the brain itself. Because honesty does not just depend on which systems are active, but on how fast they are allowed to speak. The brain does not speak in sentences, it speaks in timing. Every thought you experience, emotional or logical, fleeting or persistent, is carried by electrical rhythms that determine not only what is processed, but how deeply it is allowed to unfold. When those rhythms change, the character of thinking changes with them. At night, the brain does not merely relax control, it slows the tempo of communication itself. This shift in tempo is one of the most underestimated reasons the brain feels more honest after dark. During the day, the dominant rhythms of the waking brain are fast. Beta waves and high-frequency activity dominate regions involved in attention, decision-making, and motor preparation. These rhythms favor precision, interruption, and rapid switching. They are ideal for environments that demand quick responses and constant adjustment. Fast rhythms fragment thought. They allow the brain to jump, evaluate, interrupt, and redirect. This is useful when navigating traffic, conversation, work, and social interaction. It is not useful for sustained emotional processing. At night, as external demands diminish, the brain gradually transitions into slower rhythms. Alpha activity increases, followed by theta. These are not sleep waves yet. They are transitional states, thresholds between outward focus and inward processing. Slower rhythms do not carry information faster, they carry it farther. When neural communication slows, signals have more time to propagate across networks. Associations widen, emotional context spreads. Instead of being cut short by executive interruption, a thought is allowed to complete its trajectory. This is why nighttime thinking often feels continuous. One idea leads to another, not because the mind is wandering, but because the brain is no longer forcing segmentation. The usual stop signals, generated by prefrontal control circuits, arrive late or not at all. Electroencephalography studies show that during increased alpha and theta activity, the brain becomes less responsive to external stimuli and more sensitive to internally generated signals. Internal memories, emotions, and imagined scenarios gain priority over sensory input. This inward bias is critical. It means that once an emotional signal is activated, it is less likely to be interrupted by the environment. The room is quiet, the phone is still, the world recedes, the brain is left alone with its own activity, and in that quiet, slow rhythms allow emotional signals to resonate. Resonance is not repetition, it is amplification through synchrony. When multiple regions of the brain begin oscillating at compatible frequencies, their communication becomes more efficient. Limbic structures, memory networks, and parts of the medial prefrontal cortex begin to synchronize. This synchronization creates coherence, not narrative coherence, emotional coherence. Feelings that were previously disjointed begin to align. Memories connect not by chronology, but by affect. The brain starts grouping experiences based on how they felt, not when they occurred. This grouping is a prerequisite for integration. Integration is the process by which emotional experiences are incorporated into a stable self-model. It requires that the brain revisit emotional material in a state that is safe enough to allow sustained activation, but structured enough to avoid overwhelm. The nighttime brain exists at the edge of this balance. Slow rhythms provide the safety. Reduced control provides the access. Together, they create a state where emotional material can surface with minimal distortion from social or strategic concerns. But there is a cost. Slower rhythms reduce the brain's capacity for critical evaluation. Logical inconsistencies are less likely to be detected. Contradictions are tolerated. Emotional salience overrides factual accuracy. This is why nighttime honesty often feels convincing. The brain is not checking its work. During the day, fast rhythms allow the brain to test thoughts against external reality and social norms. At night, that testing mechanism weakens. The brain prioritizes internal consistency over external validation. This internal consistency is what gives nighttime thoughts their sense of inevitability. They feel aligned, they feel whole, they feel like they make sense. But alignment is not the same as truth. It is coherence within a particular state. To understand this, consider how memory retrieval changes with neural rhythm. Studies show that theta rhythms are closely linked to memory recall and imagination. When theta activity increases, the brain becomes more likely to retrieve autobiographical memories and construct hypothetical scenarios. These scenarios are vivid, emotionally charged, and loosely constrained by reality. They feel personal because they are built from personal material. At night, the increase in theta activity makes the brain more prone to replaying emotionally tagged memories and imagining alternative outcomes. This is not deliberate rumination. It is an automatic byproduct of rhythm-dependent processing. The brain is running simulations. Simulations are not statements of fact. They are tools for learning. But when simulations occur without strong executive oversight, they can be misinterpreted as conclusions. This misinterpretation is common. People often assume that the emotional clarity they feel at night represents insight. In reality, it represents access. The brain has opened files that are usually kept closed, and it is allowing them to play uninterrupted. The slower the rhythm, the longer the playback. This also explains why attempts to think logically at night often fail. Logic requires fast, flexible control. It requires the ability to interrupt, compare, and reframe. When the brain is operating in slower rhythms, these functions are less available. Trying to force logic into a slow rhythm state is like trying to sprint underwater. The effort increases fatigue without improving outcome. As night progresses, these rhythms continue to slow. Alpha gives way to theta more consistently. Theta begins to fragment into the earliest patterns of non-REM sleep. The boundary between thinking and dreaming becomes less distinct. This boundary is important. In this transitional state, thoughts begin to lose sharp edges. Images replace words. Emotions lose clear causes. The brain shifts from narrative processing to associative processing. This is not a failure of consciousness. It is preparation for sleep. Sleep requires disengagement from linear time. The brain must stop tracking cause and effect in order to allow synaptic reorganization. Slow rhythms facilitate this disengagement. Nighttime honesty often peaks just before this transition, not at the moment of falling asleep, but before. In this window, control is weak, emotion is active and awareness is still present. Thoughts feel deep, important, and personal. They arrive with a sense of gravity, but they are also unstable. As rhythms continue to slow, even these thoughts begin to dissolve. Emotional intensity fades, images blur. The brain releases its grip. If sleep arrives naturally, integration continues without conscious awareness. Emotional charge decreases through synaptic downscaling. Memories are reweighted. Some signals lose salience. If sleep is disrupted, the process stalls. This is where nighttime honesty can become nighttime distress. When slow rhythms activate emotional material, but sleep does not complete the cycle, the brain remains exposed without resolution. Thoughts loop. Emotions persist. Fatigue increases. Understanding the role of rhythm clarifies something essential. The brain does not become honest at night because it wants to tell the truth. It becomes honest because slower rhythms make suppression inefficient. Suppression requires speed. Honesty emerges when speed is removed. This also means that nighttime honesty is fragile. It depends on a delicate balance of rhythm, fatigue, chemistry, and context. Disrupt that balance with bright light, stimulation, stress, and the brain snaps back into faster modes. This snapback is often abrupt, a notification, a sudden noise, a burst of anxiety. Fast rhythms reassert control. Emotional material is cut off midstream. The sense of honesty vanishes, replaced by tension. The brain does not like incomplete transitions. It prefers to either stay in control or fully let go. The nighttime brain exists in between. This in-between state is powerful, but it is not meant to last. It is a passage, not a destination. Recognizing this changes how we relate to nighttime thoughts. They are not messages to act on immediately. They are not judgments to accept or reject. They are signals passing through a particular rhythmic window, signals that gain intensity because of timing, not because of authority. As we move deeper into the night, another system begins to assert influence, one that determines whether these signals are integrated smoothly or amplified into anxiety. This system is chemical rather than electrical. Hormones begin to shift. Neurotransmitter availability changes. The brain's internal environment becomes quieter, heavier, slower. And in that chemical shift lies the difference between nighttime reflection and nighttime restlessness. To understand why some nights feel calm while others feel unbearable, we need to follow the chemistry and see how hormones interact with rhythm to either soften honesty or sharpen it. Because timing sets the stage, but chemistry decides how the experience feels. As neural rhythms slow, chemistry takes over. The electrical timing of the brain determines what can surface, but chemistry determines how it feels when it does. Two people can experience the same nighttime honesty, the same reduced control, the same emotional access, and come away with entirely different sensations. One feels calm, reflective, almost spacious. The other feels tense, restless, unable to escape looping thoughts. The difference is not willpower, it is neurochemistry. At night, the brain's chemical environment changes in a predictable sequence. These changes are not random side effects of sleep. They are active signals that reshape how information is processed, weighted, and experienced. The most obvious change is melatonin, but melatonin is only the beginning. As darkness increases, melatonin secretion rises from the pineal gland. Its primary role is often misunderstood. Melatonin does not sedate the brain. It does not force sleep. What it does is lower the gain on systems designed for vigilance and outward engagement. Melatonin reduces the sensitivity of neural circuits involved in threat detection and reward pursuit. It dampens dopaminergic signaling associated with anticipation and action. It tells the brain chemically that now is not the time to chase or defend. This chemical message interacts directly with the slowing rhythms we discussed earlier. Slower rhythms create space. Melatonin softens urgency. Together, they reduce the brain's impulse to react. This is why nighttime honesty can feel gentle on some nights. Emotional material surfaces, but it does not demand immediate response. The brain is chemically biased toward observation rather than action. However, melatonin does not act alone. As night progresses, cortisol levels drop. Cortisol is often labeled a stress hormone, but that label is incomplete. Cortisol is better understood as a mobilization hormone. It increases glucose availability, sharpens attention, and prepares the brain to respond to challenges. During the day, cortisol follows a circadian rhythm with a pronounced peak in the morning. This peak supports alertness, decision-making, and social engagement. As the day ends, cortisol declines. This decline matters. Lower cortisol means reduced capacity for cognitive control. The prefrontal cortex relies on optimal cortisol levels to maintain executive functions. Too much cortisol impairs control. Too little also impairs control. At night, cortisol moves toward the lower end of this curve. The result is not just fatigue, it is a shift in dominance. With less cortisol support, executive circuits lose chemical reinforcement. They are still present, but they are less influential. Emotional and associative systems face less opposition. This chemical weakening of control contributes to nighttime honesty, but it also introduces vulnerability. When emotional material surfaces in a low cortisol environment, the brain's ability to contextualize and contain that material is reduced. This is why emotions can feel larger at night, even if they are not new. Now, consider serotonin. Serotonin plays a complex role in mood regulation, emotional stability, and impulse control. Its availability fluctuates across the day and is influenced by light exposure, sleep patterns, and individual neurobiology. At night, serotonin synthesis decreases as light exposure drops. This decrease is one of the signals that allows melatonin production to increase. But lower serotonin also reduces emotional buffering. Serotonin acts as a stabilizer. It smooths emotional transitions. When serotonin is lower, emotional states become more labile. Shifts feel sharper. Thoughts feel stickier. This is not pathology. It is context. The nighttime brain is not optimized for emotional resilience. It is optimized for emotional processing. Processing requires access. Resilience requires control. You rarely get both at the same time. This trade-off explains why some nights feel introspective and others feel overwhelming. The balance between melatonin, cortisol, serotonin, and ongoing neural rhythms determines whether honesty feels manageable or distressing. Add dopamine to this mix, and the picture becomes clearer. Dopamine is often associated with pleasure, but its core function is prediction. Dopamine signals the importance of future outcomes. It motivates pursuit. It energizes planning. At night, dopaminergic tone decreases. The brain becomes less future-oriented. Long-term goals lose salience. Immediate emotional relevance takes priority. This shift reduces anxiety about action, but it increases focus on meaning. Thoughts shift from "what should I do" to "what does this mean?" Meaning making is emotionally expensive. Without strong dopamine signaling, the brain is less motivated to resolve ambiguity through action. Instead, it sits with uncertainty. This is why nighttime honesty often involves existential themes: identity, relationships, regret, purpose. These themes are not actionable in the moment. They are interpretive. The brain is not preparing to act. It is preparing to integrate. But integration is not always comfortable. If the chemical environment favored openness without sufficient soothing, emotional material can escalate. Anxiety emerges not because the thoughts are dangerous, but because the brain lacks the chemical tools to down-regulate them effectively. This is where individual differences become important. People with naturally higher baseline anxiety, altered serotonin function, or dysregulated cortisol rhythms are more likely to experience nighttime honesty as distress rather than reflection. Their brains enter the same state of reduced control, but without adequate chemical cushioning. This does not mean something is wrong with them. It means the balance is off. The brain is doing what it is designed to do, but under less than ideal conditions. Understanding this reframes nighttime restlessness. It is not a failure to relax. It is a chemical mismatch between access and containment. The brain has opened emotional files, but the chemical environment cannot fully support their processing. Sleep is delayed. Thoughts loop. Fatigue increases. Control weakens further. A feedback loop forms. The more tired the brain becomes, the less capable it is of regulating emotion. The less regulated emotion becomes, the harder it is to sleep. The night stretches. This is why interventions that focus solely on thought content often fail at night. Trying to think differently assumes that the prefrontal cortex is available and supported. At night, it often is not. Chemical context matters more than cognitive strategy. This also explains why simple changes, lowering light, reducing stimulation, creating consistent pre-sleep routines, can have outsized effects. These changes do not address thoughts directly. They shift chemistry. Less light supports melatonin. Predictable routines stabilize cortisol. Reduced stimulation prevents dopamine spikes. The goal is not to suppress honesty. It is to soften it. Soft honesty integrates. Sharp honesty agitates. The brain does not need silence at night. It needs the right chemical slope. When chemistry supports gradual slowing, emotional material surfaces and dissolves naturally. When chemistry is disrupted, honesty becomes fixation. This distinction is subtle but critical. It means that nighttime thoughts are not instructions. They are readouts of a system in transition, a system moving from action to rest, from outward to inward, from edited to raw. Chemistry determines whether that transition feels like descent or free fall. As night deepens, another shift begins to occur, one that changes not just how thoughts feel, but how memories themselves are stored. The brain does not simply process emotions at night. It rewrites memory. And the way memory is rewritten during this window explains why nighttime honesty can reshape how we feel the next day, even if we never consciously resolve a single thought. To understand that, we have to follow the brain into the early stages of sleep, where honesty stops being experienced and starts being absorbed. When the night finally begins to pull you under, it doesn't do it with a switch. It does it with a sequence, a gentle, almost invisible handover. The brain does not go from awake to asleep like a light turning off. It transitions through states that have their own rules, their own chemistry, their own electrical signatures, and inside those states, your nighttime honesty stops behaving like a thought you can listen to and starts behaving like material being processed. This is where the story becomes even more physical, because in the earliest stages of sleep, the brain begins doing something that changes the emotional weight of your memories, sometimes without you ever noticing it happened. It starts rewriting the file, not the facts exactly, but the charge attached to the facts. The first thing to understand is that the moment you start drifting towards sleep, sensory input loses its authority. The thalamus, often described as a relay station for incoming sensory information, begins to alter how it gates signals to the cortex. It doesn't shut the world out completely. It just reduces the priority of the world. The outside fades, the inside rises. This is why the minutes before sleep can feel strangely intimate. Your brain is no longer negotiating with traffic, voices, screens, deadlines. It is negotiating with itself. And as that negotiation continues, you enter the early stages of non-REM sleep. Stage N1 comes first. Light sleep, the threshold. People often describe it as still awake, but the EEG already disagrees. Alpha activity begins to drop, theta becomes more consistent, and the brain's grip on linear attention weakens further. Thoughts in N1 can be vivid, fragmentary, and oddly symbolic. Not quite dreams, but not quite deliberate thinking either. The mind slips, images intrude, the narrative becomes porous. Then comes N2, and this is where the night begins to show its machinery. In N2 sleep, the EEG reveals sleep spindles, brief bursts of faster rhythmic activity, and K-complexes, large waves that look like the brain briefly shouting and then settling again. These patterns are not decoration. They are functional. Spindles are strongly associated with memory consolidation. They appear to reflect moments when the brain is actively reinforcing certain neural connections, selectively stabilizing what should be retained and what should be integrated. K-complexes, meanwhile, are thought to be protective and regulatory, helping the brain stay asleep while still monitoring the environment at a minimal level. In plain terms, your brain is closing the door, but keeping a thin crack open. And beneath that door, processing begins. This is the point where the idea of night honesty becomes less like confession and more like accounting. During wakefulness, especially during emotionally charged days, the brain records experience in multiple layers. The hippocampus encodes contextual details. The amygdala flags emotional relevance. The cortex stores distributed aspects of the event: faces, places, tones of voice, meanings, expectations. But those layers don't automatically agree with each other. You can know something logically, yet still feel unsettled. You can remember an event accurately, yet carry an emotional charge that doesn't match the facts. You can act fine all day, then feel crushed at night, because the brain hasn't finished integrating the emotional and contextual layers into one coherent internal model. Sleep is one of the brain's primary tools for that integration. The hippocampus is especially important here. During wakefulness, the hippocampus rapidly encodes new experiences, acting like a temporary index. But long-term storage is largely cortical. Over time, the brain transfers and reorganizes information, what researchers often describe as systems consolidation. This is not a single transfer like moving a file from one folder to another. It's more like replaying a recording while rewriting it into a different format. And that replay begins during non-REM sleep. In both animal studies and human research, scientists have observed patterns of hippocampal replay, where sequences of neural firing that occurred during learning are reactivated during sleep. It's as if the brain is rehearsing what happened, often at compressed speed, while the cortex listens and re-encodes. This is why sleep improves learning, especially procedural and declarative memory. But it also explains something more subtle. Sleep can change how an experience feels afterward, because replay is not neutral. Replay can reduce emotional intensity. How? One mechanism is synaptic homeostasis, a hypothesis suggesting that during slow-wave sleep, synapses that were strengthened during the day are globally downscaled, restoring balance and preventing saturation. If the brain strengthened too many connections during the day, especially around emotionally intense experiences, downscaling can reduce the overpotentiation that makes a memory feel loud. Think of it like turning down the volume on circuits that have been stuck too high. This doesn't erase the memory, it lowers the gain. Another mechanism involves the gradual decoupling of emotional charge from contextual recall. In non-REM sleep, emotional memory can be processed in a way that preserves the informational content while reducing its physiological punch. You may still remember what happened, but your heart doesn't react the same way. This is one reason people sometimes wake up feeling lighter without being able to explain why. The brain did the work while you were offline. But here's the twist that makes nighttime honesty so strange. The processing begins before you're fully asleep, and it can shape what you experience as you drift. If you enter sleep smoothly, the emotional material that surfaced at night may begin to lose urgency as the brain transitions deeper into non-REM. The looping thoughts soften. The sense of being trapped inside them decreases. It's not because you solved them, it's because the brain started metabolizing them. But if your sleep is fragmented, if you hover at the edge, partially awake, processing doesn't fully complete. The brain keeps reopening the file because it hasn't had enough uninterrupted time to downregulate it. This is why half sleep can feel like torture. You're tired enough that control is weak, but awake enough that emotional material remains conscious. You're stuck in the window where honesty is loud, but integration is incomplete. And this is also where people mistake nighttime experience for final truth. Because when the brain is hovering between wake and sleep, it can generate a sense of certainty without providing resolution. Emotional signals remain active, but the interpretive systems that would frame them are fatigued. The brain creates coherence through repetition rather than clarity. The thought feels true because it repeats. It repeats because it's unresolved. It's unresolved because sleep hasn't sealed the process. So the question becomes, what seals it? Deeper, non-REM sleep does. As the night progresses, some people enter slow-wave sleep, what researchers often call deep sleep, or stage N3. This is where slow oscillations dominate. Large synchronized waves sweep across the cortex. In this state, the brain's global communication is different. Neurons alternate between active and silent phases in a rhythmic pattern, like the entire cortex is breathing. This slow-wave pattern is strongly associated with restorative functions and memory consolidation. It is also associated with metabolic housekeeping, The brain's glymphatic system, its waste clearance mechanism, appears to be more active during sleep, helping remove metabolic byproducts that accumulate during wakefulness. This is not about honesty directly, but it influences how the brain feels the next day. Clearer, less foggy, less emotionally brittle. In other words, deep sleep doesn't just process your memories, it supports the hardware that runs your mind. And when the hardware is supported, the emotional volume tends to stabilize. This is why nights with strong, deep sleep often lead to mornings that feel emotionally more manageable. Not perfect, not magically healed, but less sharp. The brain has literally reduced noise. So when people say, sleep on it, they are accidentally describing a real neurobiological process. Sleep changes the emotional calculus of the brain, but it doesn't do it uniformly. Not all memories are treated equally. Not all emotional material is processed the same way. Some experiences resist downregulation. Some memories remain vivid. Some feelings persist. And that brings us to a question that has been quietly building under everything we've discussed. If non-REM sleep begins the work of integrating and softening emotional experiences, why do some nights still produce the opposite? Vivid emotional storms, intense dreams, and a strange sense that the brain is telling stories instead of healing? Because later in the night, the brain enters another state entirely. One where chemistry shifts again, rhythms change again, and the emotional system behaves in a way that can feel like honesty or like distortion. And to understand that, we have to step into the phase of sleep where the brain becomes active in a new way, even as the body stays still. The phase where the brain dreams. Later in the night, the brain does something that feels paradoxical. After slowing itself down, after reducing sensory input, after quieting large parts of the cortex, it suddenly becomes active again, not outwardly, not behaviorally, but internally, with a very specific pattern. This is the phase where many people say the brain lies, even as it feels intensely honest. This is REM sleep. Rapid eye movement sleep is not deep in the way people usually imagine. EEG recordings show that during REM, brain activity becomes fast, desynchronized, and in some regions remarkably similar to wakefulness. The difference is not speed, the difference is control. During REM sleep, the prefrontal cortex, especially the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex responsible for critical evaluation, logical sequencing, and reality testing, is significantly downregulated. At the same time, limbic and paralimbic regions become highly active. Emotion without oversight. This is not a malfunction, it is a design. REM sleep is where the brain does its most unusual emotional work. To understand why REM exists at all, neuroscientists had to let go of the idea that sleep is for rest. REM sleep is metabolically expensive. The brain consumes almost as much energy during REM as it does during wakefulness. If evolution kept REM around, it did so because it serves a function that could not be replaced. That function is emotional recalibration. During REM sleep, the brain reactivates emotional memories, often fragments, not full narratives, and recombines them in novel ways. This recombination is what you experience as dreaming. Dreams are not messages, they are simulations. In REM, the brain takes emotionally salient material and runs it through altered chemistry and altered control. One of the most important chemical changes during REM is the near-complete shutdown of noradrenaline, also called norepinephrine. Noradrenaline is central to arousal, vigilance, and stress responses. It amplifies emotional reactions and sharpens memory encoding during wakefulness. During REM sleep, noradrenaline levels drop to almost zero. This is extraordinary. It means the brain is revisiting emotional material in a state where stress chemistry is absent. Emotion is present, stress is not. This creates a unique processing window. The brain can activate memories that were emotionally charged during the day, but re-experience them without the full physiological stress response. Over repeated REM cycles, this decoupling can weaken the link between a memory and its emotional intensity. You still remember what happened, but it hurts less. This is why REM sleep is so closely linked to emotional regulation. People deprived of REM sleep show heightened emotional reactivity, increased amygdala responses, and reduced emotional resilience. Their brains have not had the chance to recalibrate emotional associations. But here is where nighttime honesty becomes complicated. REM sleep does not produce linear truth. It produces associative truth. During REM, the brain does not check facts. It does not preserve chronology. It does not maintain logical consistency. It links memories based on shared emotional tone, not shared reality. A feeling of abandonment might pull in a childhood memory, a recent conversation, and an imagined future, all woven together in a single dream narrative. The brain is not saying these events are the same. It is saying they feel the same. This is emotional categorization. From a learning perspective, this is powerful. It allows the brain to extract patterns, situations that evoke similar internal states, regardless of surface details. This helps future prediction. If a new situation feels emotionally similar to a past one, the brain can respond faster. But subjectively, this process can feel misleading because emotional similarity feels like truth. When people wake from REM-heavy nights, they often report a lingering sense of meaning. Something feels revealed, something feels understood. Yet when they try to articulate it, the content dissolves. That's because REM processing is not designed for articulation. It is designed for reweighting. REM changes how much importance the brain assigns to certain emotional themes. It does not create arguments, it adjusts priorities. This is why dreams often feel profound but vague. They are operating at a different representational level. Now connect this back to nighttime honesty. The honesty you feel before sleep is largely shaped by reduced inhibition and slow rhythms. The honesty you feel after dreaming is shaped by emotional reorganization. They are not the same. Pre-sleep honesty says, "This is unresolved." REM honesty says, "This matters in this way." But neither says, "This is objectively true." They are internal signals, not conclusions. Here is where confusion often arises. People wake up after an emotionally intense dream and interpret the feeling as confirmation. Confirmation of fear, confirmation of desire, confirmation of regret. In reality, the brain has just finished rebalancing emotional weights. The feeling is real, but it does not necessarily map onto external facts. It maps onto internal relevance. This is especially important when considering anxiety and mood disorders. In conditions like depression and PTSD, REM sleep can become altered. Noradrenaline suppression may be incomplete. Emotional memories may be replayed with too much stress chemistry still present. Instead of decoupling emotion from memory, REM reinforces it. Dreams become repetitive. Nighttime emotions intensify rather than soften. The brain is trying to process, but the chemical environment prevents resolution. This shows us something crucial. Nighttime honesty is not inherently healing. It is context dependent. The same mechanisms that allow emotional integration can, under different conditions, amplify distress. Which means the experience of honesty at night is not a reliable guide by itself. It is a signal that processing is occurring, not that processing is complete. When REM sleep works well, emotional honesty gradually loses its edge. Nighttime thoughts become less urgent over days, not because you solve them consciously, but because the brain has reweighted them unconsciously. When REM sleep is disrupted, honesty stays sharp. The same themes return, the same emotions recur. The brain keeps flagging them because integration has not succeeded. This brings us to a subtle but important point. The brain does not use honesty to tell you what to do. It uses honesty to decide what to work on. Nighttime thoughts, pre-sleep reflections, emotionally charged dreams. These are not instructions. They are task lists. They tell the brain, this still carries weight. Whether that weight is reduced depends on sleep quality, chemistry, rhythm, and repetition. So when someone says, I think more clearly at night, what they are often experiencing is not clarity, but access. And when someone says, my dreams showed me the truth, what they are often experiencing is reorganization. The danger is mistaking access for accuracy and reorganization for revelation. The brain is not a philosopher at night. It is a mechanic. It disassembles emotional components, cleans them, recombines them, and tests new configurations. Truth is not the goal. Stability is. As the night continues, REM cycles alternate with non-REM sleep. Each cycle slightly adjusts emotional weight, slightly reshapes memory associations. By morning, the brain is chemically and electrically different from the night before. This is why morning often feels like a reset, not because the problems disappeared, but because their emotional load has shifted. But there is still one question left hanging. If the brain works so hard at night to regulate emotion, integrate memory, and recalibrate meaning, why do some people still wake up feeling emotionally heavier than before? Why does honesty sometimes accumulate instead of dissolve? To answer that, we have to look at what happens when the nighttime systems are overloaded, when too much material enters the process, or when the brain never fully transitions out of vigilance. Because there is a threshold beyond which honesty stops being integration and starts becoming noise. There is a point where honesty stops being useful, not because the brain suddenly becomes wrong, but because the system that sorts relevance becomes saturated. When too much emotional material enters the nighttime processing window, the brain loses its ability to prioritize. Everything feels important, everything feels urgent, and nothing resolves. This is not a philosophical failure, it is a capacity problem. The nighttime brain is powerful, but it is not limitless. To understand why honesty sometimes accumulates instead of dissolves, we need to look at what happens when the brain's vigilance systems never fully disengage, when the chemical and rhythmic shifts we discussed earlier are incomplete. In other words, when the brain is tired but not safe. The human brain has a core assumption built into its architecture. Meaningful processing requires a low-threat environment. This assumption shaped the evolution of sleep itself. When threat is high, the brain prioritizes detection and reaction. When threat is low, it allows integration. Night was supposed to be low threat, but modern environments often break that assumption. Artificial light, irregular schedules, constant connectivity, chronic stress, unresolved social tension. These factors keep vigilant circuits partially active long after darkness arrives. The brain receives mixed signals. Slow down, but stay alert. Rest, but be ready. This mixed signaling creates instability. The locus coeruleus, a small nucleus in the brainstem that regulates noradrenaline release, plays a central role here. During the day, the locus coeruleus maintains tonic firing that supports alertness and responsiveness. During REM sleep, its activity nearly shuts off. During non-REM sleep, it decreases significantly. But under chronic stress or heightened anxiety, this shutdown becomes incomplete. Noradrenaline remains present at levels that interfere with emotional decoupling. The result is subtle but profound. Emotional memories are reactivated without the chemical safety net that allows them to soften. The brain opens the file, but cannot lower the volume. Honesty surfaces, but it arrives sharp. This is one reason nighttime thinking can feel aggressive. Thoughts do not just appear, they intrude. They interrupt rest rather than guiding it. This is not because the brain wants to punish you. It is because the brain cannot tell whether the environment is safe enough to let go. Safety, in this context, is not rational. It is neurochemical. A quiet room does not guarantee a quiet brain. If cortisol rhythms are flattened, if noradrenaline tone remains elevated, if serotonin buffering is low, the brain stays partially mobilized. Mobilization and integration do not mix well. When mobilization remains active, the limbic system continues flagging emotional material as urgent. Every unresolved signal is treated as a potential threat to future stability. The brain tries to process everything at once. This is overload. Overload changes the subjective quality of honesty. Instead of feeling clarifying, it feels chaotic. Instead of feeling deep, it feels noisy. The same themes repeat without evolution. The brain circles rather than descends. This looping is not a failure of insight. It is a failure of prioritization. Normally, nighttime processing is selective. Only emotionally tagged material above a certain threshold enters replay. But when stress systems are active, the threshold lowers. Too many items pass the filter. The brain cannot finish any of them. This explains a paradox many people experience. The more exhausted they are, the more intense their nighttime thoughts become. Exhaustion weakens control, increasing access. But exhaustion combined with stress prevents resolution. The brain opens more files than it can close. There is another factor that amplifies this effect: prediction error. Prediction error is a core concept in neuroscience. It refers to the difference between expected outcomes and actual outcomes. The brain is constantly minimizing prediction error by updating its internal models of the world. Unresolved emotional experiences often involve prediction errors. You expected safety and received rejection. You expected stability and encountered loss. You expected control and experienced helplessness. These mismatches remain active until integrated. At night, prediction error signals often resurface. But if the brain is in a vigilant state, these signals are interpreted as ongoing problems rather than past discrepancies. The brain treats them as if they still require action. Action, however, is impossible at night. This mismatch, perceived urgency without available action, produces distress. The brain is prepared to respond, but has nowhere to send the response. This is one reason anxiety feels worse at night. Anxiety is not just fear, it is readiness without direction. When readiness persists into the night, honesty becomes agitation. The brain keeps asking what needs to be done. The answer remains unavailable. And so the question repeats. This repetition is often mistaken for rumination, but it is more precise to describe it as unresolved mobilization. The brain has not shifted fully into processing mode. It is stuck between vigilance and integration. Another contributor to overload is memory density. Modern life exposes the brain to far more emotionally relevant stimuli than it evolved to handle in a single day. Social interactions, symbolic threats, abstract worries, imagined futures, all of these create emotional tagging without immediate resolution. The limbic system does not distinguish between physical and symbolic threat. It responds to emotional significance. The brain accumulates emotional tags faster than it can integrate them. Nighttime processing was designed for a slower world. When the backlog becomes too large, nighttime honesty turns into triage. The brain surfaces material not because it is the most important in an absolute sense, but because it is the loudest. Loudness, however, is not intelligence. The loudest signals are often those associated with fear, uncertainty, and loss. Positive emotional material is processed differently and often requires less urgent integration. Negative material dominates the night not because life is worse than it appears, but because negative prediction errors demand attention. This creates a skewed emotional landscape at night. The brain appears pessimistic, self-critical, or catastrophic. But this is not its worldview. It is its workload. Understanding this changes how we interpret nighttime honesty. When honesty feels overwhelming, it is not revealing your deepest truth. It is revealing system saturation. The brain is saying there is too much unresolved material to process under current conditions. This also explains why attempts to solve nighttime thoughts often fail. Solutions require executive coordination. They require future modeling, cost-benefit analysis, and sustained attention. These functions are impaired at night, especially under chemical conditions of low cortisol and fluctuating serotonin. The brain is not asking for solutions. It is asking for load reduction. Load reduction does not mean avoidance. It means lowering the number of active items. This can happen through sleep, if sleep is allowed to complete its cycles, but it can also happen through external containment, writing, externalizing, ritualizing closure. These strategies work not because they eliminate problems, but because they signal to the brain that information has been stored safely outside working memory. The brain can stand down. Without that signal, honesty keeps escalating. Now consider what happens when this pattern repeats night after night. Chronic overload changes baseline expectations. The brain learns that night is not a safe processing window. It anticipates distress. Anticipation itself increases vigilance. Vigilance further disrupts chemistry. A self-reinforcing loop forms. Night becomes associated with threat rather than integration. This is how insomnia becomes conditioned, not through lack of sleep drive, but through learned alertness. The brain predicts that night will bring unresolved honesty and prepares accordingly. Preparation prevents resolution. Breaking this loop requires changing not thought content, but context. The brain must relearn that night is a place where processing completes, not accumulates. This relearning is slow. It involves consistent signals, predictable timing, reduced stimulation, gradual transitions, and sufficient sleep opportunity. It also involves understanding that nighttime honesty does not require engagement. Engagement can wait. Processing cannot. The brain needs to be allowed to finish what it starts. And this brings us to a final critical distinction. There is a difference between listening to nighttime honesty and responding to it. Listening allows signals to be acknowledged without mobilization. Responding, planning, judging, deciding, reactivates control systems that disrupt the chemical environment needed for integration. The nighttime brain does not want answers. It wants completion. Completion often looks like silence, not insight. When completion occurs, honesty fades on its own. The same thoughts lose urgency. Emotional weight decreases. The brain releases its grip. When completion does not occur, honesty persists, not because it is true, but because it is unfinished. So the real question is not why the brain becomes honest at night. The deeper question is why, in some lives, the brain never gets the conditions it needs to finish being honest. And answering that requires stepping outside the night itself, into the day that precedes it, because nighttime honesty is shaped long before darkness arrives by how the brain is used when the light is still on. Nighttime honesty does not begin at night. It is prepared. Long before the light fades, long before melatonin rises, long before rhythms slow, the brain has already decided how heavy the night will be. The night does not create material. It reveals the balance sheet of the day. To understand why some nights feel calm and others feel unbearable, we have to look at what the brain is forced to postpone while the sun is still up. During the day, the brain operates under a principle of functional postponement. Emotional signals are continuously generated, but they are not processed immediately. They are tagged, indexed, and deferred. This deferral is not passive neglect. It is an active strategy that allows performance to continue. Every time you suppress an emotional response to stay polite, every time you delay a reaction to stay productive, every time you ignore a feeling to meet a demand, the brain does not discard that information. It stores it with a timestamp and an emotional marker. These markers accumulate. From a neuroscientific perspective, this accumulation is measurable. Studies on emotional regulation show increased amygdala activity during suppressed emotional responses, even when outward behavior remains controlled. The emotion does not disappear. It remains active beneath the surface. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex expends energy to maintain suppression. This energy expenditure is not infinite. It draws from the same metabolic pool used for attention, decision-making, and working memory. By the end of the day, the brain is not just tired, it is loaded. Load changes how nighttime processing unfolds. A lightly loaded brain enters the night with a manageable queue of unresolved signals. Slow rhythms, melatonin, and sleep architecture can process them gradually. Honesty surfaces gently, integrates, and dissolves. A heavily loaded brain enters the night already saturated. Saturation changes priorities. When the brain detects excessive unresolved emotional material, it alters its strategy. Instead of selective processing, it moves into a broadcast mode. Signals are released broadly, not because they are the most important, but because the system cannot afford to hold them all. This is why some nights feel like emotional flooding. The brain is not choosing, it is dumping. This dump is experienced subjectively as racing thoughts, emotional overwhelm, or a sense that everything is wrong at once. The content may span relationships, work, identity, future, past. The common thread is not meaning, it is backlog. Backlog is rarely acknowledged during the day because acknowledging it interferes with function. The brain is designed to delay processing until it can be done safely. But safe does not mean comfortable. The night is safer than the day, but only relative to external threat. It is not automatically safe for internal processing if the load is too high. This leads to an important insight. Nighttime honesty is proportional not just to fatigue, but to cumulative emotional deferral. People often assume that a bad night means something dramatic happened that day. This is not always true. Sometimes the trigger is subtle, distributed, and cumulative. A conversation that required restraint, a decision made against instinct, a feeling postponed because there was no time. Each one adds a small weight. The brain tracks these weights even when consciousness does not. The hippocampus and related memory structures encode not just events, but context and emotional tone. When events are emotionally incongruent, when what you feel and what you express diverge, the brain flags the discrepancy. Discrepancy is expensive. The brain prefers alignment between internal state and external action. When alignment is not possible, it tolerates misalignment temporarily. But tolerance is not resolution. Nighttime honesty is the brain's attempt to restore alignment, not necessarily by changing behavior, but by acknowledging the mismatch. Acknowledgement is the first step toward integration. This reframes a common misconception. People often say they avoid thinking during the day. In reality, the brain avoids finishing thoughts. It keeps them in a suspended state, neither resolved nor dismissed. Suspension increases tension. At night, when suspension mechanisms weaken, the tension releases. Release feels like honesty, but release without structure can feel like collapse. Now consider how modern daily patterns exacerbate this process. The contemporary brain is exposed to constant micro-demands, notifications, social evaluation, symbolic comparison, imagined futures. Each one generates emotional tagging, often without resolution. In ancestral environments, emotional tagging was tied to concrete events, threats, losses, successes. Processing could follow action. Today, many emotional tags have no clear action path. You can feel judged without confrontation. You can feel threatened without danger. You can feel loss without an event. These abstract emotional tags accumulate because they cannot be discharged behaviorally. The night inherits them. This is why nighttime honesty in modern life often feels disproportionate. The brain is processing symbolic overload with ancient machinery. Understanding this highlights something subtle. The nighttime brain is not more pessimistic than the daytime brain. It is less filtered. The pessimism is already there. The night just removes the editor. This does not mean the daytime brain is dishonest. It means it is strategic. Strategy and truth are not opposites. They are functions. The daytime brain is optimized for coordination. The nighttime brain is optimized for reconciliation. Problems arise when reconciliation is overloaded. So what determines whether reconciliation succeeds? One factor is duration. Emotional processing takes time. Integration does not occur in minutes. It requires sustained low-threat activation. This is why consistent sleep duration matters more than people realize. Short nights truncate processing. The brain opens files but cannot close them. This leaves residual activation. Residual activation carries into the next day as irritability, emotional sensitivity, or a vague sense of unease. The brain begins the next day already loaded. The cycle compounds. Another factor is continuity. Fragmented sleep disrupts the sequence of processing stages. Non-REM and REM cycles are not interchangeable. Each contributes differently to emotional integration. Interruptions prevent the brain from completing transitions. Completion matters. Incomplete processing feels like unfinished business. The brain flags it for later. Later often means the next night. This is how nighttime honesty can become chronic, not because the brain is obsessed, but because it is interrupted. There is also the role of expectation. If a person expects the night to be difficult, anticipatory vigilance increases. The brain enters the evening already mobilized. This changes chemistry before processing even begins. Expectation becomes physiology. This is not psychological weakness. It is predictive coding. The brain predicts states and prepares accordingly. If it predicts threat, it prepares vigilance. Vigilance interferes with integration. Breaking this loop requires altering prediction. Prediction changes through experience, not argument. When the brain experiences repeated nights where processing completes and rest follows, its expectations adjust. Vigilance decreases. Honesty softens, but if nights repeatedly end in distress, the brain learns that honesty is dangerous. It resists slowing. It resists letting go. The irony is that resistance increases honesty's intensity. This is why trying to control nighttime thoughts often fails. Control reactivates the same systems that delayed processing during the day. The brain interprets control as postponement. Postponement adds to backlog. What the brain needs instead is permission. Not permission to believe every thought, permission to let processing occur without intervention. This is difficult in cultures that equate thinking with problem solving. At night, thinking is not for solving. It is for sorting. Sorting requires allowing items to surface without acting on them. This distinction is subtle but crucial. When people report that nighttime honesty becomes quieter after certain changes, journaling, therapy, routine, reduced stimulation, it is not because the thoughts disappeared. It is because the brain learned that acknowledgement happens earlier and more consistently. Earlier acknowledgement reduces backlog. The brain does not need to wait until night to be heard. This leads to an important conclusion. Nighttime honesty is not a separate phenomenon from daytime suppression. They are two ends of the same system. The more the brain is forced to postpone during the day, the louder it speaks at night. The more it is allowed to register experience as it happens, the less it needs to unload after dark. The night is not a confessional booth. It is an overflow valve. When the valve opens gently, pressure releases smoothly. When it opens under strain, the release is violent. Understanding this shifts the question again. The question is no longer, why does my brain become honest at night? The question becomes, what is my brain not allowed to process while I am awake? Because the night will always answer that question, whether you want it to or not. And once we understand that, we can finally begin to ask something more practical and more unsettling. Is it possible to live in a way that reduces the need for nighttime honesty at all? Or is the night destined to carry what the day refuses to hold? To explore that, we have to examine whether the brain can learn to integrate emotional material without waiting for darkness, and what that would require from both biology and behavior. If nighttime honesty is the overflow, then the day is the dam, not a wall meant to stop emotion forever, but a structure designed to regulate flow. When the dam works well, pressure is distributed across time. When it doesn't, pressure waits until darkness, then releases all at once. So the real question becomes practical, biological, and slightly uncomfortable. Can the brain process emotional material while awake without losing function? Neuroscience suggests that it can, but not in the way most people assume. During the day, the brain has access to strong executive control, higher cortisol support, faster rhythms, and robust sensory grounding. These conditions are excellent for decision-making and action. They are also capable of supporting emotional integration, but only if integration is allowed to occur in small doses. The key variable is not intensity, it is timing. When emotional signals arise during the day, they are often dismissed because they are inconvenient. There is work to do, people to respond to, roles to maintain. The prefrontal cortex steps in and postpones processing. Postponement itself is not harmful. What matters is whether postponement ever ends. The brain is designed to tolerate short delays. It is not designed to tolerate indefinite suspension. Suspension creates load. Load accumulates. Daytime integration works when postponement is followed by brief contained acknowledgement. Acknowledgement does not mean analysis. It does not mean solving. It does not mean changing anything. It means allowing the signal to register fully enough that the brain can mark it as seen. From a neural perspective, this marking matters. When emotional information is consciously acknowledged, even briefly, it activates prefrontal limbic pathways in a different configuration than suppression does. Instead of inhibiting the signal, the prefrontal cortex contextualizes it. Contextualization reduces future salience. Suppression increases future salience. This difference has been demonstrated repeatedly in emotion regulation studies. Participants instructed to suppress emotional responses show increased physiological arousal and greater emotional rebound later. Participants instructed to acknowledge emotions without acting on them show reduced rebound. The brain is not asking for expression. It is asking for recognition. Recognition allows encoding to complete. Completion is the opposite of backlog. This suggests a counterintuitive principle. Processing less at night requires processing more during the day, but gently, briefly, and without mobilization. The problem is that many people equate processing with rumination. They assume that acknowledging a feeling will trap them in it. This assumption is understandable, but biologically inaccurate. Rumination is repetitive evaluation without resolution. Acknowledgement is exposure without escalation. The brain can tell the difference. Rumination recruits executive loops and prediction systems. Acknowledgement recruits awareness networks and then releases. One increases load, the other reduces it. This distinction explains why certain daytime practices reduce nighttime honesty without suppressing emotion. Short, reflective pauses, writing without analysis, naming a feeling without explaining it. These actions signal to the brain that information has been received. The signal does not need to be held in working memory. It does not need to be reissued at night. The dam opens slightly. Pressure drops. Another crucial factor is temporal containment. The brain integrates emotional material more effectively when it knows there is a boundary. Endless openness is not safety. It is exposure. This is why structured times for reflection, even brief ones, are more effective than constant introspection. Structure allows the brain to localize processing. Localization prevents spillover. When processing has no boundary, the brain delays it until night, when boundaries are enforced by physiology. Ironically, nighttime honesty often emerges because the day provided no container. The brain creates its own container when none is offered. There is also the role of physical state. During the day, movement, posture, and breathing patterns influence emotional processing. The brain integrates emotion more easily when the body signals stability. Chronic tension, shallow breathing, and prolonged immobility increase limbic activation and reduce integration. This is not psychological. It is interoceptive. The brain constantly monitors internal bodily states. If the body signals readiness for action, the brain postpones emotional processing. If the body signals safety, processing becomes possible. Many modern work environments signal constant readiness, sitting still but mentally mobilized, physically inactive but cognitively alert. This mismatch confuses the brain. Night removes this mismatch by forcing stillness, but the cost is delayed integration. So daytime integration often requires deliberate physical downshifting, not to relax, but to signal safety. This can be subtle: a slower walk, a deeper breath, a brief pause with no objective. These are not wellness rituals, they are neural signals. They tell the brain, now is a safe moment to register. When these signals are absent all day, the brain waits, and waiting increases nighttime load. Another underestimated factor is narrative compression. During the day, the brain often experiences events faster than it can narrate them. There is no time to form a coherent internal story. Experiences remain fragmented. Fragmentation increases emotional tagging because the brain dislikes incomplete narratives. At night, the brain attempts to assemble narratives retroactively. This assembly feels like honesty because the pieces finally align. But alignment can happen earlier if micro-narratives are allowed during the day. This does not require journaling for hours. It requires brief coherence. What just happened mattered. That felt off. I noticed that. These are not conclusions. They are markers. Markers reduce uncertainty. Uncertainty fuels nighttime processing. The brain is not obsessed with truth. It is obsessed with reducing uncertainty. Nighttime honesty is one strategy for doing that, but it is not the only one. So can the brain learn to need the night less? Yes, but not by eliminating nighttime processing, by distributing processing more evenly across time. This distribution has limits. Some material requires the chemistry of night to integrate fully. Some experiences are too emotionally dense to process while mobilized. Night will always have a role. The goal is not to silence the night. It is to keep it from carrying everything. When the day carries nothing, the night carries too much. This also explains why people going through major life transitions often experience intense nighttime honesty. The day is overloaded with demands. Processing is postponed. The night inherits a backlog it cannot clear in one cycle. Understanding this reframes the experience. Nighttime honesty is not a flaw in emotional regulation. It is evidence of deferred integration. and that means it is responsive to change. Change does not mean forcing calm at night. It means altering what the day allows. This leads to a final shift in perspective. The night is not where honesty begins. It is where honesty insists. If the brain is listened to earlier, it does not need to insist later. But if it is ignored all day, it will speak when control weakens, because biology ensures that it will, which leaves us with one last layer to examine. If the brain can distribute emotional processing across the day, why does it so often fail to do so? Why do so many lives require the night to do the work that daylight could have shared? To answer that, we have to look beyond individual habits and into the deeper structure of attention, culture, and the way modern brains are trained to value function over integration. And that is where the story turns outward, from the brain alone to the world it is trying to survive in. The reason the brain postpones so much until night is not weakness. It is training. From the moment you wake up, your attention is shaped by external demands. Tasks arrive already labeled as urgent. Signals compete for priority. The brain learns very quickly which kinds of information are rewarded with action and which are quietly ignored. This learning is not conscious. It is structural. Modern attention systems reward speed, responsiveness, and output. They punish pause, ambiguity, and inward focus. Over time, the brain adapts. It becomes efficient at filtering out internal signals that do not immediately translate into action. This efficiency is celebrated. Productivity increases, responsiveness improves, social coordination becomes smoother, but integration suffers. The brain becomes excellent at doing and poor at registering. Registering is not the same as reacting. It is the act of allowing experience to complete its first pass through awareness. Without that pass, experiences remain open loops. Open loops demand closure, and if they do not close during the day, they migrate to the night. This is where culture quietly shapes neurobiology. In environments that reward constant engagement, the brain learns that internal signals are distractions. Feelings are postponed. Subtle discomfort is overridden. Ambivalence is treated as inefficiency. The prefrontal cortex becomes dominant not just in function, but in value. Control is praised. Suppression is mistaken for strength. The brain responds by tightening its filters. Tight filters work well under load, but they increase backlog. Emotional material becomes compressed. Compression does not remove content. It stores it densely. At night, compression fails. The filters loosen and compressed material expands rapidly. What felt manageable during the day now feels overwhelming, not because it grew, but because it unfolded. This unfolding feels like honesty because it reveals what compression hid. Another factor is the fragmentation of attention. Modern attention rarely rests on a single stream. The brain switches constantly between contexts: message, task, image, comparison, obligation. Each switch interrupts emotional continuity. Emotional processing prefers continuity. It requires a stable window where a signal can rise, be contextualized, and settle. Fragmentation prevents settling. When attention is repeatedly broken, emotional signals remain partially activated. The brain cannot finish encoding them. Partial activation is unstable. It keeps signals close to the threshold of awareness. At night, when fragmentation stops, those signals finally cross the threshold. The brain does not choose which ones arrive first. It releases them in the order of accumulated salience. This is why nighttime honesty often feels disorganized. It is not telling a story. It is releasing fragments that were never allowed to connect. Connection happens later, during sleep. But before sleep, the fragments appear raw. This is not because the brain prefers rawness. It is because rawness is all that remains. There is also the role of evaluation. During the day, most internal signals are evaluated immediately, useful or not, relevant or not, appropriate or not. This constant evaluation consumes resources and biases, processing toward what can be acted upon. At night, evaluation weakens. Signals are allowed to exist without immediate judgment. This lack of judgment feels like honesty because it removes distortion, but it also removes guidance. Without evaluation, the brain does not know what to do with the signals. It simply presents them. Presentation without interpretation can feel unsettling. The brain is saying, "This is here," not "this is what it means." The meaning is constructed later, often during sleep, sometimes days later, sometimes not at all. Another reason the day fails to integrate emotion is time pressure. Emotional processing does not obey deadlines, it unfolds at its own pace. When time is scarce, the brain prioritizes completion over integration. Completion feels like resolution, but it is not the same. You can complete a task while leaving its emotional impact unprocessed. The brain records the completion, but the emotional tag remains active. At night, the emotional tag resurfaces because it was never closed. This creates a mismatch between what the brain knows happened and how it feels about what happened. Mismatch is uncomfortable. The brain seeks to reduce mismatch by revisiting the experience. But without external context, revisiting feels internal and personal. This is another reason nighttime honesty feels self-focused. It is not narcissism, it is context loss. The external frame is gone, so the brain uses the self as reference. Now consider how this interacts with identity. During the day, identity is reinforced by roles: worker, friend, partner, parent. These roles provide scripts that guide behavior and suppress ambiguity. At night, roles weaken. The brain is no longer required to perform. Identity becomes fluid. Without role-based anchors, internal contradictions become visible. I did this, but felt that. I said yes, but wanted no. I acted confident, but felt uncertain. These contradictions are not new. They were masked by role adherence. At night, the mask loosens. Honesty appears because identity is no longer being actively maintained. This does not mean the night reveals a truer self. It reveals a less constrained self. Constraint and truth are not opposites. They are parameters. The brain requires constraints to function socially. It requires looseness to integrate emotionally. The problem arises when constraints never loosen until the brain is exhausted. Exhaustion is a poor time to integrate. This leads to a critical insight. The brain does not fail to integrate during the day because it cannot. It fails because the environment does not allow slack. Slack is not laziness. Slack is biological margin. Margin allows signals to rise without threatening performance. Margin allows awareness without immediate consequence. Without margin, the brain postpones. Night provides margin by default. But margin created by exhaustion is unstable. This is why nighttime honesty is often accompanied by fatigue, irritability, and emotional sensitivity. The brain has margin, but no energy. Integration wants margin with energy. This combination is rare in modern life. Most people are either energized and constrained or unconstrained and depleted. The brain does the best it can with what it gets. So why does honesty still feel meaningful, even when it is overwhelming? Because meaning emerges from access. Access feels like discovery. When something long hidden appears, it carries emotional weight. The brain interprets weight as importance. Importance feels like truth, but importance is a signal, not a conclusion. The brain uses importance to allocate resources, not to define reality. Nighttime honesty tells the brain what to work on, not what to believe. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. If you treat nighttime honesty as instruction, you mobilize. Mobilization disrupts integration. If you treat it as information, you allow processing to continue. Information can be held without action. This is why some people learn to listen to nighttime thoughts without engaging them. Over time, the thoughts soften, not because they were wrong, but because they were processed. Processing reduces salience. Salience reduction feels like relief. But relief is not suppression. It is completion. Completion occurs when the brain no longer needs to flag the signal. So why does the brain wait until night to insist on completion? Because insistence requires leverage. During the day, leverage is low. The brain is committed to function. At night, leverage increases because control systems weaken. The brain takes advantage of this vulnerability. This is not sabotage, it is strategy. The brain uses the only window where it can bypass resistance. Resistance is not conscious defiance, it is structural prioritization. The brain prioritizes what keeps you moving. At night, movement stops, so the brain speaks. Understanding this reveals something uncomfortable but freeing. Nighttime honesty is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that your brain is adapting to constraints. The goal is not to eliminate honesty. It is to give the brain better conditions to integrate before it has to insist. That brings us to a final transition. If honesty emerges when control weakens, and if integration requires margin with energy, then there must be states where the brain can integrate without exhaustion. States that are neither full day nor full night. States where control is present but flexible. To find those states, we have to look at moments the brain already uses for integration, moments that are neither productive nor asleep, moments we usually overlook. Because the brain does not wait only for night, it waits for permission. And sometimes permission arrives in quieter places than darkness. There are moments when the brain opens, not because it is exhausted, not because control has collapsed, but because control has softened. These moments are easy to miss. They do not announce themselves like night does. They do not carry the emotional drama of midnight thoughts. They feel ordinary, almost empty, and yet, neurologically, they are some of the most important states the brain ever enters. They are the states where integration happens without pain. Neuroscientists sometimes refer to these states indirectly because they do not fit neatly into categories like focus or sleep. They are neither task-driven nor unconscious. They sit in between, resting wakefulness, idle awareness, low-demand attention. From the outside, these states look unproductive. From the inside, they are metabolically precious. When the brain is not required to perform, predict, or respond, but is also not deprived of energy, a very specific network becomes dominant. The default mode network. This network has appeared before in our story, but now it takes center stage. The default mode network is not a daydream network, despite popular descriptions. It is an integration network. It becomes active when external demands drop and internal monitoring increases. It links memory, emotion, self-referential processing, and meaning-making. Crucially, it operates best when the brain is neither overstimulated nor depleted. This is the condition night often fails to provide. At night, the default mode network is active, but energy is low and chemistry is shifting towards sleep. Integration begins, but may not complete consciously. During the day, energy is high, but the default mode network is suppressed by task demands. In these in-between states, both conditions are met. Energy is available. Pressure is low. This combination allows the brain to process emotional material without flooding or collapse. Examples of these states are deceptively simple: walking without a destination, staring out of a window, showering, sitting quietly after finishing a task before starting the next one. These moments share a key feature. They are not goal-oriented. The brain is not preparing to act. It is not anticipating evaluation. It is not switching context rapidly. This absence of demand changes neural dynamics. EEG studies show that during restful wakefulness, alpha activity increases in posterior regions, while prefrontal control remains available but relaxed. The brain is not suppressing emotion aggressively, nor is it surrendering to it. It is listening without urgency. In this state, emotional signals can surface at a manageable volume. The brain can contextualize them without mobilizing action. Memory fragments can connect gently. Meaning can form without pressure. This is integration without insistence. And it is one of the most efficient ways the brain reduces nighttime backlog. When these states are absent from daily life, the brain compensates by forcing integration at night when energy is low and control is weak. Honesty becomes loud because it has no other outlet. This reveals something critical. Nighttime honesty is not the brain's preferred method of integration. It is the brain's last resort. The preferred method is quiet wakefulness. But quiet wakefulness has become rare. Modern environments fill every pause. Silence is replaced with input. Idle moments are colonized by screens. The brain rarely enters a state where it is allowed to register experience without performing. This constant occupation prevents the default mode network from doing its work during the day. The work does not disappear. It is deferred. Deferred work accumulates emotional charge. At night, when occupation finally stops, the accumulated material surfaces all at once. This is why people who deliberately preserve idle moments often report quieter nights, not because they are calmer people, but because their brains are better scheduled. Scheduling here is not conscious planning. It is neural opportunity. The brain needs windows where integration is allowed before exhaustion. Another important aspect of these states is predictability. The brain integrates more effectively when it knows that rest will come again. If idle moments are rare and unpredictable, the brain treats them cautiously. It does not fully release control. When idle moments are regular, the brain learns that postponement is unnecessary. Emotional signals do not need to be stored for night. This learning is implicit. Over time, the brain adjusts its thresholds. It becomes less reactive at night because it no longer carries a full day's unresolved material. This does not mean that nighttime honesty disappears. It becomes softer. Thoughts still arise, but they do not demand attention. They pass through awareness without anchoring. This is often misinterpreted as emotional numbness, but it is the opposite. It is emotional completion. The brain has already done the work. There is another layer to this. Quiet wakefulness also supports a different kind of honesty, one that does not feel confessional or dramatic. It feels observational. Instead of, "I can't ignore this anymore," the tone becomes, "I notice this." This shift in tone matters. The brain distinguishes between noticing and reacting. Noticing allows integration. Reacting mobilizes. At night, noticing often collapses into reacting because energy is low and control is weakened. During quiet wakefulness, noticing can stand on its own. This reduces emotional volatility. Importantly, these states are not the same as mindfulness as it is often taught. They do not require technique, focus, or effort. Effort reactivates control. They require allowance. Allowance is passive permission for experience to register. The brain is extremely good at using allowance when given the chance, but when allowance is absent, it insists later. This brings us back to the central theme. The brain becomes honest at night, not because night is special, but because honesty needs space. Night creates space by shutting things down. Quiet wakefulness creates space by not filling it. One is forced, the other is invited. Invited honesty integrates more smoothly. Forced honesty overwhelms. This distinction helps explain why some people experience nighttime honesty as gentle and others as brutal. Those whose days contain pockets of integration experience night as continuation. Those whose days are fully occupied experience night as rupture. The brain is not punishing either group. It is adapting. This also explains why certain life changes reduce nighttime distress without directly addressing thoughts, slowing schedules, reducing multitasking, creating unclaimed time. These changes alter neural opportunity, not belief. The brain does not need convincing. It needs access. Access during the day reduces insistence at night. But here is the final complication. Even with ideal conditions, some material will always wait for night. Certain emotional processes require reduced external orientation and altered chemistry. Deep attachment wounds, existential uncertainty, long-term identity conflicts. These often integrate best across sleep cycles. Night will always matter. The goal is not to eliminate nighttime honesty. The goal is to change its role from emergency outlet to background maintenance. When that shift occurs, nighttime thoughts lose their authority. They are no longer perceived as messages or verdicts. They become what they always were, signals moving through a system doing its job. And when signals are trusted to pass, not acted upon, not feared, not suppressed, they pass. As we move closer to the end of this exploration, one question remains. If nighttime honesty is not truth, but signal, and if integration depends on when and how signals are allowed to surface, then what exactly should we do with nighttime thoughts when they appear? Ignore them? Listen to them? Write them down? Challenge them? The answer is not behavioral, it is temporal, because the brain does not ask the same thing of you at night as it does during the day. And misunderstanding that difference is what turns honesty into suffering. To understand the difference, we need to look at the one thing the brain is most sensitive to when deciding whether to escalate or release a signal: response. Not what you think, not what you decide, but how you respond moment by moment when honesty arrives. And that takes us to the next chapter. When nighttime honesty arrives, the brain is not watching what you think, it is watching how you respond. This is one of the least understood aspects of nocturnal cognition, and also one of the most consequential. The brain does not interpret response in the psychological sense. Agreement, disagreement, optimism, pessimism. It interprets response in terms of mobilization versus non-mobilization. At night, this distinction determines whether a signal dissolves or escalates. To see why, we have to look at what the brain is trying to avoid after dark. The nighttime brain is transitioning away from action. Every biological signal, melatonin, reduced cortisol, slower rhythms, is pushing toward disengagement. Any response that resembles action contradicts this trajectory, and the brain reacts to contradiction. Action, in neural terms, is not movement. It is preparation, planning, problem-solving, decision-making, judgment, self-evaluation. All of these recruit the same executive and motivational systems the brain is trying to quiet. When those systems reactivate, chemistry shifts. Cortisol rises slightly, dopamine spikes, noradrenaline flickers. The brain notices. It interprets this as the signal is urgent. Processing must continue, so it keeps the signal alive. This is the paradox of nighttime honesty. The more you engage, the longer it stays. This is why some people feel trapped in their thoughts at night. Not because the thoughts are stronger, but because every response they offer tells the brain to keep going. Consider the most common responses to nighttime thoughts. Arguing with them, trying to fix them, trying to reassure yourself, trying to make a decision, trying to reach certainty. All of these are mobilizing responses. They signal to the brain that action is required. But at night, action is unavailable. The result is escalation without resolution. The brain keeps the signal active because it believes the work is ongoing. Now consider the opposite kind of response, not agreement, not suppression, but non-mobilizing acknowledgement. This response does not attempt to change the thought. It does not evaluate its accuracy. It does not ask what should be done. It simply allows the signal to complete its activation cycle without triggering preparation. Neurologically, this matters. When emotional material is acknowledged without executive engagement, limbic activation can peak and decline naturally. The brain registers that the signal has been seen and does not need to be repeated. Repetition is the brain's backup strategy when acknowledgement fails. This is why nighttime thoughts repeat, not because they are important, but because they were responded to incorrectly. Incorrectly does not mean wrongly in a moral sense. It means incompatibly with the state the brain is in. At night, the brain is not asking for solutions. It is asking for containment. Containment is different from control. Control suppresses signals. Containment allows them to exist without mobilization. This distinction explains a phenomenon many people have noticed but not understood. The moment you stop trying to figure it out, the thought softens. This softening is not relief through avoidance. It is completion through acknowledgement. The brain says this signal has reached awareness and does not require action, so it moves on. This is also why certain simple behaviors are disproportionately effective at night. Writing thoughts down without analyzing them. Naming the feeling without explaining it. letting a thought pass without commentary. These behaviors do not solve anything. They simply shift response from mobilizing to non-mobilizing. The brain takes that as permission to proceed toward sleep. On the other hand, responses that feel helpful during the day can be harmful at night. Rational reframing, positive thinking, decision trees, long internal dialogues. These strategies rely on executive function. They are excellent tools at the wrong time. At night, they reopen the dam. The brain does not care that you're trying to calm yourself. It cares that you are preparing to act. Preparation keeps chemistry awake. This brings us to an uncomfortable insight. Nighttime honesty becomes painful not because of the thoughts themselves, but because of the timing of our response strategies. We respond to nighttime signals as if they were daytime problems. The brain experiences this as friction. Friction creates heat. Heat keeps the system active. Now consider what happens when someone learns, consciously or unconsciously, to respond differently. They notice a thought. They do not chase it. They do not push it away. They do not argue with it. They let it exist. This is not passivity. It is alignment. Alignment with the brain's current goal, disengagement. In this aligned response, the thought loses urgency. Emotional charge drops. The signal completes. Sleep becomes possible. This does not mean the issue is resolved in life. It means the brain has deferred action until a state where action is possible. The nighttime brain is very precise about this. It does not want answers. It wants postponement, but the right kind. Daytime postponement is suppressive. Nighttime postponement is permissive. Suppressive postponement stores signals. Permissive postponement releases them. This is why telling yourself, "I'll deal with this tomorrow," can work at night only if it is not followed by further thinking. The words do not matter. The physiological shift does. If the statement leads to disengagement, the brain accepts it. If it leads to more planning, it rejects it. The brain is not fooled by language. It reads state. This also explains why reassurance often fails at night. Reassurance is an attempt to reduce uncertainty through logic or prediction. But prediction systems are impaired at night. Reassurance backfires because it triggers evaluation. The brain responds. If reassurance is needed, there must be danger. So it stays alert. Silence, paradoxically, is often more reassuring than argument. Not silence of avoidance, silence of non-engagement. This is difficult because humans are trained to solve discomfort cognitively. Night requires a different skill, allowing discomfort to crest without intervention. Cresting is important. Emotional signals follow a curve. They rise, peak, and fall, if not interfered with. Interference can flatten the peak, but extend the duration. This is why suppression leads to lingering discomfort. At night, allowing the peak is often the fastest path to quiet. This does not mean indulging the thought. It means not feeding it. Feeding looks like elaboration. Starving looks like stillness. The brain understands stillness. From an evolutionary perspective, night was a time when action was dangerous. Stillness was safety. The brain evolved to associate stillness with resolution. This association persists. When you respond to nighttime honesty with stillness, you align with a deep biological expectation. When you respond with action-oriented thinking, you violate it. Violation produces alarm. Alarm amplifies honesty. Now consider the long-term consequences of response style. If a person repeatedly engages with nighttime thoughts, the brain learns that night is a problem-solving window. It begins escalating signals earlier and more aggressively. Insomnia develops. Nighttime anxiety increases. If a person repeatedly allows signals to pass without engagement, the brain learns that night is a processing window. Signals soften. Honesty becomes quieter. Learning occurs through repetition, not insight. You do not need to understand this intellectually for it to work. The brain updates based on outcomes. If non-engagement leads to sleep, the brain repeats it. This also explains why some people experience relief after therapy sessions or deep conversations earlier in the evening. Not because issues were solved, but because acknowledgement occurred at a time when energy was still present. Night did not have to insist. The brain prefers cooperation. Nighttime honesty is what happens when cooperation fails. So what should one do when honesty appears? Nothing in the behavioral sense, but something very specific in the physiological sense. Reduce mobilization, allow completion, preserve stillness. This is not advice. It is alignment. The nighttime brain does not want help. It wants space. And when it gets that space, it often does exactly what it was designed to do, quiet itself. But this brings us to the final and perhaps most subtle question. If response matters more than content, and timing matters more than truth, then what is the actual role of nighttime honesty in a well-functioning brain? Is it a warning, a teacher, a messenger? Or is it something far less dramatic and far more biological? To answer that, we have to step back one last time and look at nighttime honesty not as experience, but as maintenance. Because the brain does not become honest at night to reveal who you are. It becomes honest at night to keep itself stable. And understanding that reframes everything. If nighttime honesty were a message, it would be exhausting. If it were a lesson, it would be cruel. But the brain does not use the night to teach. It uses the night to maintain itself. This is the part most people miss. Nighttime honesty is not communication to you. It is communication within the system. You are not the audience. You are the environment. To understand this, we have to stop treating thoughts as statements and start treating them as signals in a regulatory loop. The brain is not built to seek truth. It is built to preserve functional stability across time. Stability does not mean comfort. It means continuity. A stable brain can predict itself. An unstable brain cannot. Nighttime honesty exists because prediction breaks down during the day. Throughout waking life, the brain is forced to behave in ways that do not fully align with its internal signals. It predicts one outcome, receives another. It prepares one response, executes a different one. These mismatches are tolerated temporarily, but they must eventually be reconciled. Reconciliation is maintenance. Think of nighttime honesty the way you would think of background processes on a computer. They do not ask permission. They do not wait until the user is ready. They run when system load is low enough to allow them to. Night provides low external load, so the brain runs diagnostics. These diagnostics are not verbal, they are experiential. They show up as thoughts, images, emotions, bodily sensations. Not because the brain wants you to interpret them, but because this is how the system surfaces discrepancies. A discrepancy is any mismatch between expectation and outcome, between intention and behavior, between emotional signal and social expression. The brain cannot delete discrepancies, it can only integrate them. Integration means updating the internal model so that future predictions improve. That update process requires access to raw data. During the day, raw data is filtered. At night, filters weaken, so raw data appears. This appearance feels like honesty because it lacks polish. But polish is not truth. Polish is optimization for others. Night removes optimization. What remains is not truth. It is uncompressed information. Uncompressed information feels heavier because it contains more variance. The brain has not yet reduced it to a usable summary. Summarization comes later, often during deeper sleep, sometimes across multiple nights. The mistake humans make is assuming that the appearance of uncompressed information means it must be acted upon. But action is not the goal of maintenance. Stability is. Maintenance processes do not demand response. They demand non-interference. This is why nighttime honesty reacts so strongly to how you respond. If you mobilize, the brain interprets this as interference. The maintenance process pauses. The system remains unstable. The signal persists. If you remain still, the process continues. The system updates. The signal fades. This dynamic is identical to what happens during physical healing. If you pick at a wound, healing slows. If you leave it undisturbed, complex biological processes unfold on their own. Nighttime honesty is the brain's wound care. Not every discomfort is damage, but every unresolved discrepancy is friction. The brain reduces friction at night. This reframes a core fear many people carry. If I don't engage with these thoughts, I'm avoiding something important. From the brain's perspective, the opposite is often true. Engagement is avoidance of rest. The brain is saying, I will handle this if you let me. Another way to see this is through the concept of error correction. In control systems theory, a system remains stable by continuously detecting and correcting error. The correction does not require conscious intervention. It requires accurate feedback and time. Nighttime honesty is feedback. It shows the brain where internal error exists. The feeling of intensity corresponds to the size of the error, not the moral importance of the content. Large error feels urgent. Small error feels faint. Urgency is informational, not directive. The brain does not expect you to fix the error consciously. It expects to reduce the error internally through recalibration. Recalibration is slow. It requires repetition. It requires cycles. This is why nighttime honesty often repeats themes rather than delivering conclusions. The brain is sampling the same signal across multiple states, adjusting weight gradually. From the outside, this looks like obsession. From the inside, it is convergence. Each repetition slightly alters synaptic strength, slightly changes emotional association, slightly updates expectation. Over time, the signal no longer needs to be raised. The brain stops flagging it. That stopping is what people describe as peace, not because life became simple, but because internal prediction improved. Understanding nighttime honesty as maintenance also explains why it is indifferent to narrative. Maintenance does not care about your story. It cares about your parameters. Your thoughts may jump between unrelated topics because the brain is not telling a story. It is scanning for instability, a relationship memory, a future fear, a bodily sensation, a childhood image. These are not chapters. They are readings. Each one is the brain asking, is this settled yet? When the answer becomes yes, not intellectually, but physiologically. The reading stops. This also explains why trying to understand yourself at night often fails. Understanding is a daytime activity. Maintenance is not semantic. The brain is not asking you to know yourself. It is trying to normalize itself. Normalization feels like quiet. Quiet is not emptiness. It is equilibrium. So what is the correct role of consciousness in this process? Minimal. Consciousness is allowed to witness, but not to direct. This is uncomfortable for humans because we are trained to believe that awareness must lead to action. At night, awareness is sufficient. In fact, awareness plus stillness is the optimal condition. This is why certain contemplative traditions independently discovered nighttime non-engagement long before neuroscience described it. Not because of philosophy, but because biology rewards it. When the brain receives stillness during maintenance, it completes cycles faster. When it receives interference, it escalates. This brings us to an important clarification. Nighttime honesty does not mean listen to your thoughts. It means do not fight their presence. Listening implies interpretation. Presence implies allowance. Allowance lets the system work. This distinction is subtle, but it explains why people who listen deeply at night often feel worse, while those who let thoughts pass feel relief. Depth is not always helpful. Completion is. Completion does not look like insight. It looks like fading. Signals fade when they are no longer needed. Now consider what happens the next day. After a night where maintenance completed, the brain wakes with updated parameters. Emotional reactivity is lower. Certain thoughts no longer arise. The person may not know why. They just feel different. This is not mood, it is recalibration. The brain quietly adjusted itself. After a night where maintenance was interrupted, the brain wakes with residual error. Reactivity remains high. Thoughts persist. The system did not finish its work. Nighttime honesty will return, not to teach, to retry. Seen this way, nighttime honesty is not a burden. It is persistence. The brain keeps trying until stability improves. And that brings us to the final shift in perspective. The goal is not to eliminate nighttime honesty. The goal is to change your relationship to it, from audience to environment. You're not meant to extract meaning. You are meant to provide conditions. Conditions for maintenance are simple, but not easy. Low stimulation, low mobilization, low interference, high permission. When those conditions are present, honesty becomes background noise rather than foreground demand. The brain does its work quietly, and eventually, honesty no longer needs to speak loudly, because stability has been restored. This is why the healthiest relationship with nighttime thoughts is not fascination, fear, or obedience. It is respect. Respect for a system that knows how to repair itself. As long as you stop interrupting it. And with that understanding, we are finally ready to move toward the closing arc of this exploration. Because if nighttime honesty is maintenance, then the deepest question is not what it says, but what happens when maintenance is complete. What does the night sound like when the brain no longer needs to speak? And how does silence, when it finally arrives, change the way we live in the light? That is where the story goes next. When maintenance is complete, the night changes its texture, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that is unmistakable once you have felt it. The thoughts do not disappear. They lose their gravity. They arrive without pulling attention toward them. They pass without leaving residue. The mind does not feel empty. It feels unburdened. This is what silence actually is. Not the absence of thought, but the absence of insistence. The brain has stopped flagging errors. To understand why this matters, we have to examine what the brain is doing when it is no longer occupied with internal correction. When emotional discrepancies are integrated, predictive load decreases. The brain no longer needs to simulate, replay, or test alternatives with urgency. Its internal models align more closely with lived experience. Alignment reduces noise. Noise, in neural terms, is unnecessary signaling. It is activity that does not improve prediction or action. During periods of instability, noise increases because the brain is trying multiple strategies at once. When stability improves, the brain becomes quieter, not because it is less active, but because it is more efficient. This efficiency is the hidden goal of nighttime honesty. Not insight, not catharsis, efficiency. A stable brain wastes less energy correcting itself. This is why mornings after a quiet night feel different, even when sleep duration is the same. Cognitive effort feels lower. Emotional reactions feel proportionate. Decisions feel less strained. Nothing magical happened. The brain simply finished its work. Importantly, this quiet is fragile, not because it is weak, but because it depends on continued alignment between experience and internal model. When new discrepancies arise, and they always do, the brain will again require processing. Nighttime honesty will return, but it will return as maintenance, not crisis. This distinction changes how we interpret relapse. People often fear that the return of nighttime thoughts means something has gone wrong. From the brain's perspective, it means something new has arrived. Stability is not a permanent state. It is a dynamic balance. The brain expects to recalibrate repeatedly across life. This expectation removes a great deal of unnecessary anxiety. Nighttime honesty does not mean you are back at the beginning. It means the system is updating. What changes over time is not whether honesty appears, but how loudly it needs to speak. A brain that trusts its environment speaks softly. A brain that expects interruption shouts. Trust here is not emotional trust. It is procedural trust. The brain learns whether its maintenance cycles are respected. When cycles are consistently allowed to complete, when nights are not treated as problem-solving sessions, when days include moments of integration, the brain reduces the intensity of its signals. It does not need to insist. This leads to a subtle shift in identity. People often describe themselves as overthinkers or night thinkers. These labels feel personal, but they are largely situational. They describe how the brain has adapted to constraints. When constraints change, the identity loosens. This can feel disorienting. Without constant internal commentary, people sometimes feel unsure who they are. They mistake quiet for emptiness. But emptiness is not what emerges. What emerges is availability. Mental space that is not immediately occupied by correction can be used for creativity, connection, or rest. The brain is no longer busy fixing itself. This availability explains why people often report increased creativity after periods of emotional integration. Creativity thrives when internal noise is low. New associations can form without being drowned out. It also explains why chronic nighttime honesty is exhausting. Maintenance consumes resources. When it never finishes, the brain is always tired. Finishing maintenance restores capacity. This brings us to a final, often overlooked effect. When nighttime honesty softens, the day changes too. Not because the night taught you something, but because the brain's thresholds have shifted. Emotional signals during the day are processed earlier. They do not need to be postponed. The brain does not wait until exhaustion to listen to itself. This creates a feedback loop. Earlier integration reduces night load. Reduced night load improves sleep. Improved sleep increases daytime capacity. Increased capacity allows earlier integration. The loop stabilizes. This is what resilience actually looks like in the brain. Not strength, not positivity, but efficiency across cycles. Understanding this reframes how we think about mental health entirely. Mental health is not the absence of difficult thoughts. It is the brain's ability to process them without escalation. Nighttime honesty is not pathology. It is a sign of a working system under constraint. The work is not to silence it, but to reduce the constraints that force it to speak loudly. This does not require perfect days or perfect nights. It requires consistency. Consistency in timing. Consistency in response. Consistency in allowing cycles to complete. Over time, the brain adjusts. The night becomes quieter, not because life is easier, but because the brain is better calibrated to it. And when the night is quieter, something unexpected happens. The day becomes more honest, not in the dramatic sense of confession or revelation, but in the subtle sense of alignment. Thoughts and actions diverge less. Emotional signals are noticed earlier. Decisions feel less conflicted. Honesty moves out of the night. It no longer needs the darkness to exist. This is not enlightenment. It is logistics. The brain found a better schedule. As we move toward the final chapters of this exploration, one last question remains. If the brain can learn to distribute honesty across time, if it can integrate without insisting, if silence is not emptiness but completion, then what is the role of night now? What does the night become when it is no longer burdened with backlog? Because the night does not disappear. It transforms. And understanding that transformation reveals the quietest and perhaps most important function of sleep itself, a function that has nothing to do with honesty and everything to do with letting go. When the night is no longer burdened with backlog, it stops negotiating. It stops arguing with the day. It stops reopening files. It stops insisting on being heard. What remains is not silence in the dramatic sense, but release. This is the phase of night that most people never learn to recognize because it leaves no story behind. There is nothing to remember, nothing to interpret, nothing to report the next morning. And yet, neurologically, this phase may be the most consequential of all, because this is where the brain lets go of ownership. To understand what that means, we need to look at a function of sleep that is rarely described in psychological terms, but is fundamental to neural health: decoupling. Throughout the day, the brain binds experiences tightly to the sense of self. This binding is useful. It allows learning, accountability, continuity. You remember what you did, what you felt, what you intended. But binding is costly. Every bound experience increases self-referential load. The brain must keep track of how events relate to identity, values, plans, and expectations. Over time, this creates a dense web of self-linked data. Nighttime honesty begins as an attempt to reconcile inconsistencies within that web. But once reconciliation is complete, another operation becomes possible. The brain begins to loosen the bindings themselves. This is not forgetting. It is depersonalization without loss. During the deepest phases of non-REM sleep, particularly slow-wave sleep, large-scale cortical synchronization changes how information is represented. Neurons fire in coordinated up-down states, reducing the precision of individual representations. Fine-grained detail blurs. Boundaries soften. In this state, the brain is not focused on who experienced something, but on what needs to be retained for future prediction. Self-reference becomes less important than pattern extraction. This is where letting go happens. Letting go does not mean emotional detachment. It means releasing the need to carry everything as mine. Experiences that were once tightly linked to self-concept become integrated into broader schemas. They are no longer held as unresolved personal discrepancies. They become part of the background model. This process is quiet because it is subtractive. The brain is not adding insight. It is removing weight. This is why nights that truly complete maintenance often leave no trace in memory. You wake up without a narrative, without a lesson, without a realization. You just feel lighter. People often underestimate these nights because they cannot point to anything that happened. But something did happen. The brain reduced self-referential density. This matters more than most psychological breakthroughs. A brain overloaded with self-referential material is brittle. Every new experience collides with existing identity structures. Reactions intensify. Defensiveness increases. Honesty becomes threatening. A brain that periodically decouples is flexible. New information can be absorbed without destabilizing the whole system. Nighttime release is what allows this flexibility. This also explains why people who never experience deep, uninterrupted sleep often feel stuck in themselves. They are not lacking insight. They are lacking decoupling. The brain cannot loosen its grip on identity. Identity becomes rigid not because it is strong, but because it is overbound. Overbinding is expensive. The night, when allowed to complete its work, reduces binding. This reduction has a specific subjective signature. The mind feels spacious. Thoughts feel optional. Emotions feel present, but not demanding. This is often mistaken for detachment or numbness, but numbness is absence of signal. This state is presence without ownership. The brain is still processing information. It is simply no longer tagging everything as personally urgent. This distinction is crucial. Urgency is a flag used to allocate resources. When urgency drops, the brain conserves energy. Conservation allows recovery. Recovery is not rest. It is restoration of margin. Margin is the brain's ability to absorb variability without destabilizing. Nighttime release restores margin. This is why people often feel more patient, less reactive, and more tolerant the day after a night of deep release. They have margin. They are not calmer because they decided to be calm. They are calmer because the system is less compressed. This also sheds light on why certain substances, practices, or experiences can mimic aspects of nighttime release, but rarely replicate it fully. Some substances reduce self-referential processing temporarily. Some meditative practices quiet identity narratives. Some intense experiences force perspective shifts. But sleep does this systematically, repeatedly, and with biological precision. Sleep is not an altered state. It is a maintenance state, and the release that occurs during sleep is not optional. It is required. Without periodic release, honesty becomes heavy because everything is personal. Every thought feels like a statement about who you are. Every emotion feels like a verdict. Release reminds the brain that not everything needs to be carried forward. This has implications far beyond nighttime thinking. It changes how memory is stored. Memories that pass through release are retained as information, not as unresolved self-judgment. They inform behavior without dominating it. Memories that do not pass through release remain active. They continue to demand attention. They resurface at night as honesty because they were never unbound. This is why trauma disrupts sleep so profoundly. Trauma creates experiences that resist decoupling. The brain keeps them tightly bound to self and threat. Nighttime release cannot occur because vigilance never fully disengages. Honesty becomes chronic alarm. Understanding this helps distinguish between normal nighttime honesty and pathological persistence. Normal honesty resolves into release. Pathological honesty repeats without release. The difference is not content, it is outcome. Release is the outcome the brain is seeking. Now consider how this reframes the role of consciousness. Consciousness is not the agent of release. It is the context in which release is either allowed or blocked. When consciousness insists on meaning, judgment, or control, release is delayed. When consciousness provides stillness, release proceeds. This is why people who stop trying to use the night often sleep better. Use implies purpose. Purpose implies control. Release requires non-purpose. This is deeply counterintuitive in a culture that values intention. At night, intention is interference. The most supportive thing consciousness can do is become irrelevant. This does not mean dissociation. It means non-centrality. The brain does not need you to disappear. It needs you to stop directing. This also explains why falling asleep often happens only when you give up trying to sleep. Trying recruits agency. Agency delays release. Release arrives when agency stands down. The night, when functioning properly, moves through a sequence. First, honesty surfaces unresolved material. Then, maintenance integrates discrepancies. Then, release decouples self-reference. Finally, silence emerges. This silence is not emptiness. It is unburdened continuity. The brain continues to exist without commentary. This is the condition in which the deepest forms of rest occur. Not because the brain is inactive, but because it is no longer correcting itself. Correction is effortful. When correction stops, energy is conserved and redistributed. This redistribution supports immune function, metabolic regulation, and neural repair. These processes are not directly related to honesty, but they depend on the same release. A brain that cannot let go cannot heal efficiently. This is why chronic sleep disruption affects physical health so profoundly. The cost is not just fatigue, it is incomplete release. Now consider the psychological implications. People often chase meaning in nighttime thoughts because they believe meaning is what resolves discomfort. But meaning is a daytime tool. At night, meaning delays release. Release resolves discomfort by removing the need for interpretation. This is why wisdom traditions that emphasize surrender, stillness, or non-attachment often converge with what neuroscience observes about sleep, not because they share metaphysics, but because they discovered similar constraints. The brain releases when it is not being managed. This brings us to an important practical shift. If nighttime honesty is a precursor to release, then the goal is not to avoid honesty, but to not interrupt its progression toward release. Honesty is the opening. Release is the closure. Many people get stuck at the opening. They mistake the appearance of honesty for the end of the process. In reality, it is the beginning. The end is quiet, and quiet does not announce itself. This leads to a final reframing of silence. Silence is not the absence of content. It is the absence of necessity. Nothing needs to be said. Nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be carried. The brain has done what it needed to do. When nights regularly reach this point, life begins to feel less heavy. Not because problems vanish, but because problems are no longer welded to identity. The self becomes lighter, and a lighter self moves through the day differently. This sets the stage for the final chapters of this exploration. Because once the brain learns how to release at night, something unexpected happens during the day. The day begins to change its posture, not in behavior, but in anticipation. The brain no longer braces for night. It no longer hoards unresolved material. It no longer needs to insist later. And that changes how honesty functions altogether. In the next chapter, we will look at what happens when the night stops being the only place the brain can let go, and how that transformation quietly reshapes the way a person lives, chooses, and relates to uncertainty, not by effort, not by insight, but by a nervous system that finally trusts the cycle it is part of. When the brain no longer braces for the night, the day changes first, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally at the level of expectation. Expectation is one of the most powerful forces in the nervous system. The brain is a prediction machine. It is constantly estimating what will happen next and preparing accordingly. When it expects overload, it tightens. When it expects completion, it relaxes. For many people, the brain expects the night to be difficult. This expectation is learned. Night after night of unresolved honesty teaches the brain a pattern. Darkness equals escalation. So long before the sun sets, the brain begins preparing. Vigilance increases. Control tightens. Emotional signals are deferred even more aggressively during the day because the brain is conserving energy for what it anticipates will be a long internal battle. This anticipation alone increases nighttime intensity. But when release begins to occur, when nights are allowed to complete their cycles, expectation updates. The brain learns something new. Night does not require defense. This learning has consequences. During the day, the brain stops hoarding unresolved material. It does not need to save everything for later. Emotional signals are allowed to register sooner at lower intensity. The threshold for acknowledgement drops. This is not a conscious decision. It is predictive adaptation. The brain adjusts its strategy based on outcomes. If night resolves, day loosens. And when day loosens, honesty no longer has to wait for darkness. This is where a subtle but profound transformation occurs. Honesty stops being episodic. It becomes ambient, not in the sense of constant self-analysis, but in the sense of reduced internal friction. Thoughts and feelings align more closely with actions. There is less divergence between what is felt and what is done. This alignment does not feel like bravery. It feels like ease. The brain is no longer constantly correcting itself. Correction is what creates tension. Alignment reduces the need for correction. This does not mean life becomes simple or conflict-free. It means conflict is processed earlier and at lower amplitude. Discrepancies are addressed while they are small. Small discrepancies do not need nighttime insistence. Large discrepancies do. This shift explains why people who experience consistent restorative sleep often report changes in daytime behavior that feel spontaneous. They speak more directly. They tolerate ambiguity better. They react less defensively. These changes are not moral improvements. They are mechanical outcomes. A brain with margin does not need to protect itself as aggressively. Margin comes from release. Release comes from completed cycles. Completed cycles change prediction. Now consider what happens to uncertainty in this state. For many people, uncertainty is what fuels nighttime honesty. Uncertainty creates prediction error. Prediction error demands resolution. When resolution is postponed, uncertainty grows louder. But when the brain trusts that processing will occur, either during quiet wakefulness or at night, uncertainty loses urgency. It is still present. It just does not demand immediate closure. This is a critical point. The brain does not need certainty. It needs confidence in its ability to update. Nighttime honesty becomes unbearable when the brain believes that unresolved material will remain unresolved. When release is unreliable, uncertainty feels dangerous. When release is reliable, uncertainty is tolerable. This tolerance changes behavior. People stop rushing to premature conclusions. They stop forcing decisions at night. They stop treating every emotional signal as a verdict. They wait. Waiting is not passivity here. It is trust in the cycle. The brain knows that if something truly matters, it will return, but in a form that can be integrated. This trust also changes how the brain handles fear. Fear is not just an emotion. It is a signal that something threatens prediction. At night, fear often amplifies because prediction systems are weakened and emotional systems dominate. But in a brain that has learned release, fear does not escalate as easily. The brain does not interpret fear as a call to immediate action. It interprets it as data to be processed later. Later can mean morning. Later can mean after sleep. Later can mean never if the signal fades. This shift reduces catastrophizing, not because the brain becomes optimistic, but because it becomes patient. Patience is a neurobiological capacity. It depends on the brain's confidence in future processing. Nighttime release builds that confidence. Now look at identity again from this new angle. Earlier, we saw how release loosens self-binding. In the daytime, this loosening expresses itself as flexibility. The person feels less defined by momentary states. A bad mood does not immediately become, "This is who I am." A mistake does not immediately become, "This is my nature." These interpretations require tight self-binding. When binding is looser, experiences pass through without becoming self-statements. This reduces shame. Shame is not simply feeling bad about an action. It is the binding of action to identity. When that binding loosens, shame loses intensity. Nighttime honesty often carries shame because unresolved discrepancies are still bound to self. Release unbinds them. The next day, the same memory may exist, but without the sting. This is often misinterpreted as avoidance or denial. It is neither. It is resolution at the level the brain actually uses. Another consequence of this shift is reduced internal narration. The brain narrates when it is trying to make sense of instability. Narration organizes experience into story form. Story provides coherence when prediction is weak. When prediction improves, Narration quiets. This does not mean the mind becomes blank. It means less commentary is required. The person may still think, but thinking is not constantly explanatory. This quiet is often described as presence, but presence is not a skill here. It is a byproduct. The brain no longer needs to explain itself to itself. This frees cognitive resources. Those resources can be used for attention, creativity, learning, or simply rest. This is why people sometimes report feeling more themselves after a period of good sleep, even though they cannot articulate what changed. What changed is not content, it is load. Load reduction changes experience globally. Now consider what happens when a new stressor enters. Even in a well-regulated brain, stress will create discrepancies. Emotional signals will be deferred. Nighttime honesty may increase temporarily, but the difference is scale. The brain does not panic. It does not escalate prematurely. It does not assume failure. It treats the increase as temporary maintenance, not a return to crisis. This prevents secondary anxiety, the anxiety about anxiety. Secondary anxiety is what often turns a difficult night into a pattern. The brain begins worrying about the night itself. When release has occurred reliably in the past, the brain does not develop this meta layer. Nighttime honesty remains situational, not identity defining. This is a crucial distinction. People often think they are night people or overthinkers, when they are actually living in a nervous system that has learned to delay integration, change the cycle, and the label dissolves. This does not mean that everyone can eliminate nighttime thinking entirely. Some individuals have neurobiological traits, higher sensitivity, greater emotional depth, stronger associative networks that predispose them to richer internal activity. But richness is not the same as burden. A brain can be active without being heavy. The difference lies in whether activity is coupled with urgency. Urgency is the marker of incomplete processing. When urgency drops, activity becomes background. Background activity is not distressing. Now consider the broader implications. If nighttime honesty becomes maintenance rather than emergency, then the night reclaims its original function, rest. Rest is not inactivity. It is freedom from correction. A resting brain is not fixing itself. It is simply operating. This is when the deepest physiological repairs occur. Immune modulation, metabolic regulation, synaptic pruning. These processes require a brain that is not constantly signaling error. Release enables repair. Repair supports resilience. Resilience allows adaptation. This entire chain begins with how the brain is allowed to respond to honesty, not with insight, not with control, but with trust in the cycle. Trust here is not belief. It is learned expectation. The brain learns what usually happens next. If what usually happens next is escalation, it braces. If what usually happens next is resolution, it relaxes. This learning is slow and embodied. No single night changes it, but patterns do. This brings us very close to the end of this exploration, because once the brain learns that honesty does not require engagement, that release is possible, and that cycles complete, the night stops being a special place. It becomes ordinary. And when the night becomes ordinary, something remarkable happens. The fear of honesty disappears. Thoughts can arise without being feared. Emotions can surface without being interrogated. Uncertainty can exist without being closed. The brain no longer needs darkness to allow truth-like signals to pass. Honesty becomes quiet enough to live with. This is not enlightenment. It is a nervous system that has stopped arguing with time. And in that quiet agreement with time, the brain finds what it was seeking all along. Not answers, not meaning, not certainty, but continuity. The ability to move from one state to the next without tearing itself apart. In the final chapters, we will look at what this continuity feels like from the inside, not as theory, but as lived experience, and why people often mistake it for something mystical, even though it is deeply biological. Because when the brain finally trusts the night, it begins to trust itself. And that trust changes everything that comes after. When the brain begins to trust itself, the change is not loud. There is no revelation, no sudden clarity, no moment where everything makes sense. What appears instead is something far more subtle and far more stable. The brain stops monitoring itself so closely. This shift is easy to underestimate because we are used to equating awareness with health. We assume that paying attention to our thoughts, our emotions, our inner state is always beneficial. But from the brain's perspective, constant self-monitoring is a sign of uncertainty. Monitoring is expensive. It consumes resources. It keeps circuits active that would otherwise rest. It creates a feedback loop where awareness feeds urgency. When the brain does not trust its own regulatory cycles, it monitors aggressively. It checks repeatedly. Is this resolved yet? Is this safe yet? Am I okay yet? Nighttime honesty often emerges inside this monitoring loop. But when trust develops, not conceptual trust, but biological trust, monitoring decreases. The brain no longer needs to keep asking. This reduction in monitoring changes the subjective experience of thought itself. Thoughts still occur, but they are not tracked. They do not trigger meta-thoughts. They do not generate commentary about their presence. This is often mistaken for not thinking much. In reality, the brain is thinking efficiently. Efficiency means fewer echoes. An echo is a thought about a thought. An echo amplifies load without adding information. Most mental suffering comes not from primary thoughts, but from echoes. At night, when control weakens, echoes can proliferate. A thought arises, then another arises about why it arose, then another about what it means, then another about what should be done. This cascade is exhausting. When the brain trusts its cycles, it allows primary thoughts to arise without generating echoes. They pass through without multiplying. This is one of the clearest markers that nighttime honesty has shifted from emergency to maintenance. The content may be similar. The experience is not. Now consider how this affects sleep onset. Many people struggle not because they cannot sleep, but because they cannot stop watching themselves try to sleep. Monitoring keeps the brain alert. Alertness delays release. When monitoring decreases, sleep arrives without effort. Not because the person let go, but because the brain no longer needs supervision. This is why advice like stop trying to sleep works only after trust is established. Without trust, stopping effort feels dangerous. The brain fears losing control. With trust, effort becomes unnecessary. This distinction explains why techniques often fail when applied mechanically. Techniques assume the brain is ready to stop monitoring. Many brains are not. Readiness comes from repeated cycles of completion. Once completion is reliable, techniques become irrelevant. The brain does not need instructions to do what it evolved to do. Another change that occurs when trust develops is a shift in how the brain treats ambiguity. earlier, ambiguity fueled nighttime honesty because unresolved questions demanded attention. When the brain trusts its ability to update, ambiguity loses urgency. Uncertainty becomes tolerable. This does not mean the brain becomes indifferent. It means it no longer treats uncertainty as an error state. Error states demand correction. Open states allow time. Time is the missing variable. The brain becomes anxious when it believes there will be no opportunity to update. Nighttime honesty often reflects that fear. If I don't think about this now, I'll never resolve it. Trust dissolves that fear. The brain knows there will be another cycle, another night, another quiet moment, another chance to integrate. This knowledge changes the emotional tone of thoughts. Urgency drains away. Without urgency, thoughts no longer feel like commands. They feel like weather, present, shifting, non-binding. This metaphor is common for a reason. Weather is a system that moves on its own. You can observe it without trying to control it. The brain, when trusted, behaves similarly. Now consider the impact on emotional pain. Pain does not vanish. Loss still hurts. Fear still arises. Regret still appears. But pain becomes episodic rather than ambient. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Ambient pain, the kind that hums constantly, is usually a sign of unresolved processing. The brain keeps a low-level signal active because it does not trust that it will be addressed. When trust develops, the brain allows pain to crest and recede. This receding is crucial. People often believe that strong emotions should diminish only after insight or action. In reality, many emotions diminish after integration alone. Integration does not require understanding. It requires exposure under the right conditions. Nighttime release provides those conditions. Over time, the brain learns that exposure does not destroy it. This learning is deep. It reshapes threat perception. The brain becomes less reactive, not because it is numb, but because it has evidence that it can survive emotional activation without collapse. This evidence is experiential, not intellectual. It accumulates night after night. This is why one good night rarely changes everything, but many ordinary nights can. Ordinary nights are the most powerful teachers. They teach the brain that nothing catastrophic happens when it lets go. Another effect of trust is a reduction in emotional forecasting. The brain often tries to predict how bad something will feel in the future. This forecasting drives anxiety, especially at night. When trust is low, the brain forecasts aggressively to prepare. When trust is high, forecasting decreases. The brain no longer needs to simulate worst-case scenarios. Simulation is expensive. Without simulation, nights become quieter. This also affects dreams. As trust develops, dreams often become less emotionally charged. They may still be vivid, but they lose their intensity. The brain no longer needs dramatic recombination to decouple emotion from memory. Dreams become more neutral, more abstract, sometimes even forgettable. People often worry when their dreams fade, but fading dreams are often a sign of successful emotional processing. The brain does not need to dramatize when calibration is complete. This is rarely discussed, but it matters. Not all vivid dreams are healthy. Not all quiet nights are empty. Silence is often the end product of good processing. Now step back and look at the arc we've traced. Nighttime honesty begins as an overflow of deferred integration. It intensifies when control weakens. It becomes painful when monitoring and mobilization interfere. It resolves when release is allowed. It transforms when trust develops. At this point, honesty no longer needs to appear as thought. It becomes background alignment. This alignment changes how the brain interacts with the world. Decisions feel less conflicted, reactions feel less personal, mistakes feel less defining. The brain is no longer constantly repairing itself. Repair has finished. Maintenance continues, but quietly. This brings us to a final, often surprising observation. When nighttime honesty quiets, people often report feeling more present, not less reflective. They notice things more clearly, they listen better, they feel more connected. This is not because they are thinking more deeply. It is because less internal bandwidth is consumed by correction. Attention is freed. Freed attention naturally turns outward. This is why people sometimes say they feel more alive after a period of good sleep and emotional integration. The brain is no longer preoccupied with itself. This is not self-transcendence. It is self-efficiency. The brain has enough capacity to engage with the world again. This engagement feeds back into the cycle. Meaningful engagement reduces discrepancy. Reduced discrepancy lowers nighttime load. Lower load deepens trust. The system stabilizes. At this point, the night has completed its transformation. It is no longer the place where the brain argues with itself. It is the place where the brain confirms that it can let go. And once that confirmation is established, something remarkable happens. The brain stops asking why it feels the way it does. It stops interrogating its own experience. It simply moves from state to state. This is what people often call peace, not as an emotion but as a baseline. Peace is not happiness. It is lack of internal resistance. Resistance requires effort. When resistance drops, life feels lighter even when circumstances are unchanged. This is the quiet gift of nighttime release. It does not change the story of your life. It changes how tightly the story is held. And with that, we are approaching the final threshold. Because once the brain learns to trust its cycles, another question arises. One that goes beyond night and day. If honesty no longer needs darkness, if release no longer needs exhaustion, then what remains of the night at all? What is the deepest function of sleep once maintenance, honesty, and release have all done their work? To answer that, we have to move past honesty entirely and into the phase of night where the brain is no longer processing the past, but quietly preparing the future. When the brain no longer uses the night to resolve the past, it turns its attention forward, not consciously, not strategically, but biologically. This is the phase of sleep that is least felt and most consequential, because once honesty has softened, maintenance has completed, and release has occurred, the brain enters a mode that is not about correction at all. It is about calibration for what comes next. This is where the future is quietly shaped, not imagined, not planned, prepared. During the later cycles of sleep, particularly the interplay between lighter non-REM stages and REM, the brain begins adjusting its internal parameters. These parameters govern sensitivity, responsiveness, learning rate, and emotional thresholds. They determine how easily you will react tomorrow, how quickly you will adapt, how much novelty you can tolerate, how flexible your thinking will be. This is not goal setting. It is tuning. Every system that learns must decide how much to change in response to new information. Change too much, and the system becomes unstable. Change too little, and it becomes rigid. Sleep is when the brain sets this balance. This tuning is subtle because it does not operate on ideas. It operates on probabilities. The brain updates how likely certain interpretations are, how strongly certain associations are weighted, how quickly certain emotions activate. You do not feel this happening. You feel it later, as ease or tension or openness or resistance, without knowing why. This is why mornings can feel different without explanation. Nothing happened, but something was adjusted. When nighttime honesty is unresolved, this tuning cannot occur properly. The brain remains focused on error correction. It cannot move forward while it believes the past is unfinished. This is why people stuck in chronic nighttime distress often feel stuck in life more broadly. The brain is busy stabilizing yesterday. It has no bandwidth to prepare tomorrow. But when release occurs, tuning resumes. The brain begins to ask a different kind of question, not what went wrong, but how ready am I? Readiness is not motivation, it is capacity. A tuned brain is more adaptable. It does not overreact to small perturbations. It does not cling to outdated predictions. It updates smoothly. This smooth updating is what people experience as confidence, not bravado, not certainty, but a quiet sense that they can handle what arises. This confidence does not come from thinking through scenarios. It comes from a nervous system that has calibrated itself appropriately. Sleep is where that calibration happens. There is an important implication here. The night is not only where the brain lets go, it is where the brain decides how permeable it will be tomorrow. Permeability determines learning. A brain that is too closed resists new information. A brain that is too open is overwhelmed. Nighttime tuning sets the permeability window. This is why sleep deprivation impairs learning so profoundly. The brain does not just lose energy, it loses calibration. It does not know how much to change in response to experience. Everything feels either too much or not enough. This also explains why emotional resilience fluctuates with sleep quality. Resilience is not toughness, it is calibrated permeability. When permeability is well tuned, emotions pass through without sticking. When it is mistuned, emotions either bounce off or flood in. Nighttime honesty, when unresolved, skews this tuning. The brain becomes overly sensitive. It expects instability. It widens its detection thresholds. This leads to hyperreactivity the next day. When honesty resolves, tuning stabilizes. Sensitivity becomes proportional. The brain is neither numb nor raw. This proportionality is the hidden foundation of mental health. Now consider how this tuning interacts with meaning. People often believe that meaning is discovered through reflection, but meaning, in the brain, emerges from pattern recognition over time. Patterns can only be recognized when noise is low and parameters are stable. Nighttime tuning reduces noise. It allows the brain to notice recurring structures across experience. These structures feel like meaning because they are reliable. Meaning is not insight, it is consistency. A tuned brain recognizes consistency more easily. This is why people often report a clearer sense of direction after periods of good sleep, even without conscious planning. The brain has recalibrated its sensitivity to what matters. What matters is not chosen, it is detected. Detection depends on tuning, so the night, once freed from backlog, becomes a quiet architect. It does not tell you what to do, it shapes how you will experience doing. This is also why nighttime disturbances have such a broad impact. When tuning is disrupted, everything feels off. Decisions feel harder. Interactions feel sharper. The world feels slightly hostile or slightly dull. People often attribute this to mood. But mood is an output. The input is calibration. Now, look again at honesty from this future-oriented perspective. Nighttime honesty is not there to tell you who you are. It is there to clear the field so tuning can occur. Honesty clears discrepancies. Release removes weight. Tuning sets readiness. These three processes form a sequence. If honesty is interrupted, release stalls. If release stalls, tuning is distorted. If tuning is distorted, the next day feels wrong. This chain explains why nighttime struggles echo into daytime functioning. The brain is not haunted by thoughts. It is miscalibrated, and miscalibration is uncomfortable. Understanding this reframes the importance of sleep entirely. Sleep is not rest for yesterday. It is preparation for tomorrow. Honesty is just the first gate. Once that gate is passed, the brain moves on. When people fixate on nighttime thoughts, they stay at the gate. The brain wants to go further. It wants to prepare. Preparation requires quiet. This quiet is not emptiness. It is readiness without narrative. Now consider how this affects agency. When the brain is well-tuned, actions feel more natural, less forced, less second-guessed. People often describe this as flow in everyday life. Flow is not special performance. It is low internal resistance. Resistance comes from competing predictions. Tuning reduces competition. This is why good sleep makes even ordinary tasks feel easier. The brain is not fighting itself. The night has already settled the arguments. So what remains of the night once honesty, maintenance, release, and tuning have occurred? What remains is something surprisingly simple: continuity. The brain preserves continuity across states. You fall asleep one person and wake up another, but not a different one, a more coherent one. Coherence is not consistency of thought. It is consistency of internal parameters. This coherence is what allows learning across days, emotional growth across years, and adaptation across life. Without it, experience fragments. Nighttime honesty is often experienced as fragmentation because coherence has been strained. When coherence is restored, honesty becomes unnecessary as an event. It becomes implicit. This brings us to the final chapter, because once we understand that the night is not about truth, not about insight, not about confession, but about continuity and preparation, the original question dissolves. The question was never, why does the brain become honest at night? The real question is, what is the brain trying to protect? And the answer, revealed slowly across every chapter, is simple. The brain is protecting its ability to keep going, to move forward without tearing itself apart, to meet the future without dragging the unresolved past behind it. In the final chapter, we will step back one last time, not to summarize, not to conclude, but to sit with what remains when the night has done its work. Because the end of honesty is not silence, it is readiness. And readiness has a very particular feeling, one that most people recognize instantly, even if they have never named it. That feeling is where this exploration quietly ends, and where the next day truly begins. Readiness does not feel like confidence. Confidence is loud. Readiness is quiet. It is the feeling of waking up without needing to check how you feel first, the absence of an internal scan, the lack of urgency to interpret your own state. Nothing announces itself as better. And that is the point. When the brain is ready, it does not comment on readiness. It simply proceeds. This is the final transformation of the night. Not insight, not healing as a story, not resolution as an idea, but a subtle shift in baseline. The brain no longer carries the night into the day. This does not mean the past disappears. Memories remain. Emotions still arise. Questions still exist, but they are no longer sticky. They do not cling to attention. They do not demand immediate categorization. They wait. Waiting is the clearest sign that the system trusts time. A brain that does not trust time rushes. A brain that trusts time allows sequence. Sequence is everything. Experience unfolds. Signals arise. Signals pass. Meaning emerges later or not at all. Nothing is forced. This is why readiness often feels like neutrality. Not apathy, not indifference, but a lack of internal resistance. Resistance is what makes experience heavy. It is the friction between what is happening and what the brain thinks should be happening. When that friction drops, life feels smoother, even when it is difficult. This smoothness is often mistaken for detachment. But detachment implies distance. Readiness is closeness without grip. You are present, but not entangled. This is the state the brain quietly prepares for each night when conditions allow, not to make you happy, not to make you wise, but to make you functional across uncertainty. Uncertainty never goes away. What changes is the brain's posture toward it. Earlier, uncertainty demanded resolution. Now it invites observation. Observation does not mean passivity, it means response without panic. The brain no longer needs to collapse the future into the present through worry. It allows the future to arrive when it arrives. This allowance changes behavior. People become less reactive, not because they learned restraint, but because reaction is no longer necessary. The system does not feel under threat. Threat is what creates urgency. Urgency is what drives nighttime honesty into suffering. When threat perception softens, honesty loses its edge. It becomes information again. This is the quiet endpoint of the cycle. The night does its work. The brain calibrates. The day begins without commentary. Nothing needs to be understood for this to happen. In fact, understanding often gets in the way. The brain does not need explanation to regulate itself. It needs conditions. Those conditions are simple in description and complex in practice. Time, sequence, permission, non-interference. When these are present often enough, the brain stops asking to be heard, not because it has nothing to say, but because it trusts that it will be listened to when it matters. Trust is the final product of the night. Not trust in thoughts. Not trust in feelings. Trust in process. The brain learns that signals arise, are processed, and resolve without collapse. This learning is deep. It changes how the brain meets everything else. Stress no longer feels like a verdict. Emotion no longer feels like identity. Thought no longer feels like command. They become events. Events pass. This is not a special state. It is the default state of a system that is allowed to complete its cycles. Most people have experienced this briefly, after a long rest, after deep sleep, after a period where nothing demanded interpretation. They often describe it simply as feeling okay. Not great, not fixed, just okay. That okay is readiness. It is the feeling of being able to continue, and that is what the brain is always protecting. Not truth. Not meaning, not certainty, continuity. the ability to move from one moment to the next without internal fracture. The night is not sacred, it is practical. It exists because some processes require darkness, stillness, and reduced control to occur. When those processes are allowed, the brain does not become enlightened. It becomes usable, usable for living. So if the brain becomes honest at night, it is not because the night reveals something hidden, it is because the night removes obstacles. What remains is not a secret. It is simply what has been waiting to move through. And when it finally does, there is nothing left to say about it. Only the next breath, the next morning, the next ordinary day, which feels lighter, not because it holds answers, but because it no longer carries the weight of unfinished nights.